Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. That night was colder than usual for that time of year. I remember because my breath fogged up the air when I loaded the last bag into the trunk of my car. I was parked in the far corner of the lot, the only space left when I arrived earlier. The shopping center had emptied out as the stores closed, and now the parking lot was nearly deserted except for a few scattered cars under dim yellow lights. It felt open and exposed, like being on a stage with no audience. I had just shut the trunk when I noticed him. He was standing about 2 cars away, leaning against the passenger side of a beat-up sedan. I didn't see him there before, and I'd been back and forth to the car a few times already. He wasn't doing anything at first, just standing there, arms crossed, staring in my direction. I avoided looking directly at him. Maybe he was waiting for someone, I thought. I opened the driver's side door, trying not to look like I was rushing, but my hands fumbled with the keys. I dropped them, and the sound of them hitting the ground felt too loud in the stillness. When I bent to pick them up, I glanced in his direction again. He had moved closer. He wasn't leaning anymore. He was standing straight, hands in his pockets, still staring. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I climbed into the car as quickly as I could, locking the doors the moment I was inside. I sat there for a second, pretending to check my phone, hoping he'd move on. He didn't. He stood there, not directly in front of my car, but close enough that I couldn't ignore him. I started the engine, the sound breaking the silence. He still didn't move. I glanced in the rearview mirror, then over my shoulder as I backed out of the space, careful to keep my distance from where he stood. As I turned toward the exit, I saw him out of the corner of my eye, walking briskly toward the car he'd been leaning on. It wasn't until I was out on the main road that I let myself relax a little. I figured he was probably leaving too, and it was just bad timing. I told myself not to overthink it, but I kept checking the rearview mirror. The headlights of a car appeared a few seconds later, pulling out of the lot behind me. At first, it didn't seem unusual. It was a busy area, and people were always coming and going, even late at night. But when I made my first turn, the car followed. I turned again, onto a quieter residential street, and so did they. It wasn't just the same direction, it was the same exact moves, every turn I made. The thoughts settled in my stomach like a stone. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it could still be a coincidence. I kept driving, taking another turn, then another, until I was looping through streets I didn't normally use. The car stayed with me, always at the same distance. When I reached a 4-way stop, I decided to test it. I signaled right but turned left at the last second. The car hesitated, then turned left too. My chest tightened, and my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard they hurt. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go home, not with him following me. I didn't want him to know where I lived. I thought about calling someone, but who? The police? I didn't even have proof yet, just a sinking feeling that this wasn't normal. I drove toward the main road again, hoping the traffic and lights would give me some kind of advantage. The car stayed close, its headlights bright in my mirror. I started weaving through lanes, taking random turns, anything to shake them off. It didn't work. Then I noticed something. The car wasn't just following, it was closing the distance. When I slowed down, they slowed down. When I sped up, they sped up too. It felt deliberate, like they wanted me to know they were there. I turned onto a long stretch of road with no streetlights, just empty fields on either side. My heart was pounding now, and my breathing felt shallow. I pressed harder on the gas, hoping I could put some space between us. The car behind me did the same. Suddenly, their headlights started flashing, on and off, like they were signaling me. It made my stomach churn. I didn't know what they wanted, but it felt like a game to them. They swerved slightly, their car edging closer to mine, and I realized they weren't trying to follow, they were trying to scare me. I spotted a gas station up ahead, its bright lights like a beacon in the darkness. I didn't think twice. I turned sharply into the lot, my tires screeching against the pavement. I pulled right up to the front, where the lights were brightest and a security camera was mounted on the building. The car didn't follow me in. It slowed down just enough for me to see it clearly, a dark sedan, windows tinted so I couldn't make out the driver. It lingered at the entrance for a moment, then sped off into the night. I sat there in my car, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I didn't get out right away. I kept my eyes on the road, half expecting the car to circle back, but it didn't. Eventually, I went inside the gas station, the bright fluorescent lights feeling like a shield. I told the clerk what had happened, and he let me stay there while I called someone to come pick me up. I left my car in the lot that night. It was safer there than anywhere else. I never found out who was in that car or what they wanted. The thought still creeps into my mind sometimes, especially when I'm out late. I don't park in empty lots anymore, and I always check my mirrors when I drive. You never know who might be watching. I had been looking at the place for weeks. The old factory sat at the edge of town, boarded up and covered in graffiti. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The windows were shattered, and the chain link fence around it was rusted and bent in spots where people had clearly climbed over. I was drawn to it not for anything illegal, just for photos. I liked urban exploration, capturing places that were forgotten and falling apart. The factory seemed perfect for that. I went late in the afternoon, thinking I'd be out before it got too dark. The neighborhood was quiet, with only a few houses scattered down the road. I parked a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention and walked the rest of the way, my camera bag slung over one shoulder. I'd done this kind of thing before, sneaking into abandoned spots, so I wasn't too nervous. I knew to stay quiet and keep an eye out for anyone who might be hanging around. The gap in the fence was easy to find. I slipped through and made my way toward the building, careful not to step on anything that might make noise. The air inside smelled musty and damp, like rotting wood and rust. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, scraps of metal, old papers. I pulled out my camera and started taking photos, focusing on the textures and shadows, the way the light from outside filtered through the cracks and holes. At first, I didn't hear them. I was too focused on getting the shot, adjusting the settings on my camera. It wasn't until I moved deeper into the building, into a larger room that must have been a factory floor, that I realized I wasn't alone. The sound was faint at first, a scrape of something against the floor, a quiet shuffle. I froze, my heart starting to pound. I thought maybe it was an animal, a stray cat or a raccoon. Then I heard voices, low and murmuring, somewhere ahead of me. I turned off my camera, the small click of the button sounding louder than it should have. I thought about leaving right then, but my curiosity got the better of me. I crept forward, stepping as lightly as I could, until I could see into the next room. There were 3 of them, sitting around a makeshift fire in an old oil drum. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in layers of mismatched clothes, their faces gaunt and tired. They didn't see me at first, too absorbed in whatever conversation they were having. I should have backed away right then, but instead, I shifted to get a better view, and my foot knocked into a loose piece of metal. The sound was sharp and echoed through the room. All three heads snapped toward me at once. One of the men jumped to his feet, his eyes narrowing as he spotted me in the shadows. "What the hell are you doing?" he barked, his voice rough and angry. I held up my hands, trying to show I wasn't a threat. "I'm just taking pictures," I said quickly. I didn't know anyone was here. The second man stood up too, glaring at me. "Pictures of what?" he demanded. "You spying on us?" No, nothing like that," I said, my voice shaking. "I just take photos of old buildings." "I didn't mean to bother you." The woman stayed seated, but her eyes were locked on me, cold and unblinking. The first man took a step toward me, and I instinctively backed up. "Let me see the camera," he said, holding out his hand. I hesitated. "I can delete the pictures if you want," I offered. "I wasn't trying to." "Give me the camera," he interrupted, his tone more threatening this time. I didn't move. Handing it over felt like a bad idea. My camera was expensive, and more than that, I had a feeling they weren't going to just let me walk out of here once they had it. The second man moved closer too, and I realized I was cornered. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm. "I'll leave right now." "I didn't see anything, I swear." The first man smirked, but it wasn't a kind expression. "You already saw too much," he said. "We can't have you running your mouth about this place." I didn't know what he meant by that, but it didn't sound good. The second man reached for my bag, and I yanked it away, stepping back again. My foot caught on something, and I stumbled but didn't fall. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the first man said. He pulled something out of his pocket, a knife. It wasn't big, but it didn't need to be. My stomach twisted, and my hands gripped the strap of my bag tightly. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll leave, and you'll never see me again." The woman finally stood up, her arms crossed. "He's lying," she said. "He'll go straight to the cops." I shook my head. "No, I won't," I insisted. "I don't care what you're doing here. I just want to leave." The first man stepped closer, the knife glinting in the dim light. "Then hand over the camera," he said. "Now." I couldn't think. My heart was racing, and my palms were sweaty. I knew if I gave it to him, it wouldn't end there. I glanced around, looking for a way out. The door I came through was too far, and they were between me and it. There was another door on the other side of the room, half open and leading into darkness. Before I could talk myself out of it, I bolted. I ran for the open door, clutching my camera bag against my chest. I heard them shout behind me, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they gave chase. The next room was smaller, filled with old machinery and stacks of rusted metal. I weaved through the clutter, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear them getting closer, their voices angry and sharp. I spotted a narrow staircase in the corner and ran for it. The stairs creaked loudly under my weight, but I didn't stop. I reached the second floor, a long hallway lined with broken windows. The air was colder up there, the wind whistling through the gaps. I turned down the hall, looking for a way out. At the end, I saw a door hanging off its hinges, leading to an outside fire escape. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with the effort. Behind me, I heard them reach the top of the stairs. I pushed through the door and onto the fire escape, the metal shaking under my feet. I climbed down as quickly as I could, nearly slipping on the last step. When I hit the ground, I didn't stop running. I didn't look back. I just ran, cutting through the overgrown weeds and broken pavement until I reached the fence. I scrambled through the gap and kept going until I reached the street. Only then did I stop, leaning against a lamppost to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto my camera bag. I didn't see them again. I don't know if they chased me past the building or gave up when I reached the fence. I didn't stick around to find out. I got in my car and drove straight home, my chest still tight with fear. I haven't gone back to that factory since. When I first moved into the dorms for college, I didn't know what to expect. The building was old, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbors on both sides. My window looked out onto a small courtyard with a few trees and some benches, and beyond that was another dorm. It wasn't the most private setup, but it was my space, and I figured I'd get used to it. The first few weeks went by without anything strange happening. I kept busy with classes and getting to know people in the building. My roommate had dropped out right before the semester started, so I ended up with a single room. I liked having the space to myself, even if the room sometimes felt too quiet late at night. It was one of those nights when I first noticed him. I'd been up late working on a paper, the desk lamp the only light in the room. It was close to 2 a.m., and I was about to call it quits when something made me glance at the window. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I spotted him, just a shadowy figure standing in the courtyard, facing my window. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. He didn't move. He was just standing there, and even though I couldn't see his face clearly, I felt like he was looking right at me. My blinds were open, and the lamp lit up the whole room, making me feel exposed. I thought about getting up to close them, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was someone taking a break from studying or just passing through. After a minute or two, I turned off the lamp and crawled into bed, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. When I peeked out from under the blanket, the figure was gone. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. I kept busy with classes and tried not to think about it. But that night, I made sure to close the blinds before it got dark. I didn't want to take any chances. Things seemed normal for the next few days. Then I came back to my room after a long day of classes and noticed something strange. My door, which I always locked, was slightly open. I stopped in the hallway, staring at it. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving that morning. I always double-checked. I pushed the door open slowly, half expecting to find someone inside. The room looked normal at first glance, but as I stepped in, I noticed little things that were off. My desk chair was pulled out when I always left it tucked in. A notebook I'd left on the desk was now on the bed. My closet door was ajar, even though I always kept it shut. I stood there for a long time, my heart racing. Nothing was missing as far as I could tell, but the feeling of someone being in my space was worse than if they'd stolen something. I checked the door lock to make sure it wasn't broken, but it seemed fine. I thought about reporting it to campus security, but I didn't know what to tell them. Nothing was stolen, and I didn't have proof that anyone had been there. That night, I locked the door and pushed my desk against it for good measure. I didn't sleep much. Every little noise from the hallway made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside my door, but when I got up to check, there was no one there. The next few days were quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I started keeping the blinds closed all the time and even covered them with a blanket at night. I couldn't focus on my classes or anything else. I felt like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Then one night, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of my doorknob rattling. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but when I opened my eyes, I could see the knob twisting, like someone was trying to open it. The desk I'd pushed against the door kept it from moving, but the sound sent a chill down my spine. I grabbed my phone and dialed campus security. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. While I waited for them to answer, the rattling stopped. I heard footsteps moving away down the hall, but I was too scared to open the door and look. When the security officer arrived, I told him what had happened. He checked the hallway and even looked around outside the building, but he didn't find anything. He said it was probably a prank or someone trying the wrong door by mistake. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I knew it wasn't an accident. I couldn't stay in my room that night. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch in another building. The next morning, I went back to my room to grab some clothes, and that's when I found it. There was a note taped to my window. It was just a scrap of paper with 3 words scrawled on it. I see you. My stomach dropped. I ripped the note down and stuffed it in my pocket, my hands trembling. That was enough for me. I went straight to the campus housing office and told them everything. At first, they didn't seem to take me seriously, but when I showed them the note, their attitude changed. They offered to move me to a different building, and I didn't hesitate to accept. I spent the rest of the semester in a new room on the other side of campus. I never saw the man in the courtyard again, and my new door stayed locked every time I left. But I still double-checked it every night before I went to bed, and I never left the blinds open. Even now, I can't sit near a window without feeling like someone might be watching. I had been driving all day, trying to cover as much ground as possible before stopping for the night. The stretch of highway I was on was barren, with nothing but scrubby fields on either side. It was late, maybe just past 10, and the fuel gauge had been blinking for a while. I didn't want to risk breaking down in the middle of nowhere, so when I saw the dimly lit sign for a gas station up ahead, I pulled in. The place looked rough, more like a relic than a functioning business. The lights on the overhang flickered, and the pumps were the old kind with dials instead of digital screens. There was only one car in the lot, parked near the side of the building, its windows fogged over. The store itself was small, with a single window and a door that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But I didn't have a choice. I parked at the closest pump and got out. The night was colder than I expected, and the wind whipped through the lot, carrying the faint smell of burnt rubber. I grabbed the nozzle and started filling the tank. The pump moved slow, the numbers creeping upward like they were stuck. While I waited, I glanced around. There was no one else outside, just the faint hum of the lights overhead. It felt too quiet, even for a place like this. When the tank was full, I walked into the store to pay. The bell over the door jingled weakly as I stepped inside. The air smelled like stale cigarettes and something metallic, like old pennies. The clerk was an older man with a weathered face, sitting behind the counter. He barely looked up as I approached. I told him the pump number and handed over a few bills. That's when he looked at me, really looked at me, and leaned forward slightly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he said, "You shouldn't stay here long." I frowned, unsure if I'd heard him right. "What do you mean?" He shook his head and glanced toward the window. "Just pay and go. Don't waste time." There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. He wasn't joking or trying to mess with me. His eyes were serious, almost pleading. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and stuffed my change into my pocket. As I turned to leave, he added, "Lock your doors." I stepped outside, the bell jingling behind me. The wind had picked up, and the lot felt even darker than before. I was halfway to my car when I noticed them, 3 figures standing near the edge of the lot, just beyond the reach of the flickering lights. They weren't there when I pulled in. I was sure of it. They didn't move, just stood there, watching. I quickened my pace, reaching for my keys as I approached the car. My hands fumbled with the remote, and the locks clicked open just as I reached the driver's side door. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching against the gravel. I turned my head and saw them moving toward me, spreading out as they came closer. There were 4 of them now, not 3. One of them was a woman with long, stringy hair, her face pale in the dim light. The others were men, all dressed in dark, loose clothing. They didn't say anything, just kept walking until they were close enough to block my car from all sides. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Where you headed?" she said, her voice light, almost friendly. "Just passing through," I replied. My hand was still on the door handle, but I didn't want to turn my back on them. Something about the way they stood, so casual yet deliberate, made my stomach twist. "Late for a meeting?" one of the men asked. He was tall, with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek. His tone was mocking, like he thought this was funny. "I need to get going," I said, trying to step toward the door. The scarred man moved to block me, his grin widening. The others started to circle, their footsteps slow and deliberate. They were close enough now that I could see the tension in their shoulders, the way their hands hung at their sides, loose but ready. "Not so fast," the woman said. She stepped closer, her head tilted as she looked me up and down. "We were just getting to know you." I felt my chest tighten. My pulse was pounding in my ears. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said. "Neither do we," she said, her smile still fixed in place. "Just stay a while." I glanced toward the gas station, hoping the clerk would come out or call someone, but the window was dark and the store looked empty. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The group was close enough now that I couldn't make a run for it without one of them grabbing me. The scarred man stepped forward and reached for my jacket. "Let's see what you've got," he said, his voice low and menacing. I slapped his hand away and took a step back, bumping into the car. "Back off," I said, my voice louder than I intended. It echoed in the empty lot, but no one else was around to hear it. His grin disappeared, replaced by a hard, cold expression. "You've got some nerve," he said, his tone flat. Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing the front of my jacket and slamming me against the car. Pain shot through my back as I struggled to push him off. The others closed in, their faces emotionless, like they were watching a choreographed routine. In a panic, I reached into my pocket and grabbed my keys, jabbing them into the scarred man's arm. He yelled and let go, stumbling back. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I threw open the car door and jumped inside, slamming it shut just as one of the others tried to grab me. I hit the lock button and started the engine, my hand shaking so badly that I almost dropped the keys. The woman banged on the window, her smile gone, replaced by a snarl. "Get out," she screamed, her voice muffled by the glass. The scarred man was pounding on the hood, his eyes wild with rage. The others were circling the car, kicking at the tires and trying the door handles. I threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I backed out of the lot. They chased me, running after the car as I turned onto the highway. The woman threw something, a rock or maybe a piece of metal, that bounced off the rear windshield with a loud crack. My heart was pounding as I sped away, watching them grow smaller in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the gas gauge still hovering near empty. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. When I finally pulled over at a rest stop, I locked the doors and sat there for a long time, trying to calm down. I never reported it. I didn't even tell anyone about it for weeks. but I can still see their faces when I close my eyes, especially the woman's smile. It wasn't just anger or malice, it was enjoyment, like she was savoring the fear. I've driven past a lot of gas stations since then, but I never stop at one unless it's crowded, no matter how low the tank gets. The night shifts at the library were always quiet, almost too quiet. It was just me, the books, and the faint hum of the air conditioning. Most nights, I welcomed the solitude. I could sort returns, straighten the shelves, and get lost in my thoughts without interruption. That night started the same as any other. The last few patrons had left at 8 p.m., and I locked the doors behind them. I had 2 hours before I could shut everything down and head home. I spent the first hour organizing the mystery section. Someone had returned a whole stack of Agatha Christie novels, and I liked putting them back where they belonged. The silence was comforting at first, the kind that felt safe. But as the clock ticked closer to closing, it started to feel heavier, like the air was pressing down on me. At 9:45, I decided to do a final walkthrough to make sure everything was in order. The library wasn't big, just one main floor with rows of bookshelves and a small reading area by the windows. I walked the aisles, straightening books and picking up stray bits of trash left behind. Everything was normal until I reached the back corner where the biographies were. That's when I saw him. He was crouched low behind one of the shelves, almost completely hidden. I only noticed him because of a flicker of movement, the way his shoes shifted against the carpet. My first thought was that it was a teenager, someone who had stayed behind as a prank. It had happened once before. Some kids thought it would be funny to hide until closing and scare me when I turned out the lights. "Excuse me," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "We're closed. You need to leave." He didn't move at first. I couldn't see his face, just the top of his head and the way his shoulders hunched forward. I took a step closer, keeping the shelf between us. "Sir?" I tried again, louder this time. He straightened slowly, like he had all the time in the world. When he stood, I realized he wasn't a teenager. He was a grown man, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. His clothes were plain dark jeans, a gray hoodie, but there was something about the way he carried himself that put me on edge. His hands hung loose at his sides, and his head tilted slightly, like he was sizing me up. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice calm, almost polite. "We're closed," I said again. "You shouldn't be here." He didn't move. Instead, he took a small step toward me, just enough to close the distance by a few inches. "I was just looking around," he said. "It's a nice library." "You work here?" "Yes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "But you need to leave. Now." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's your name?" I ignored the question and took a step back. "I'm going to have to call security if you don't leave." His smile widened, and he leaned slightly against the shelf, like he wasn't in any hurry. "Security? Do you even have security here?" The question hit me harder than it should have. He was right. The library didn't have a security guard, not during my shifts. It was just me, a locked door, and the assumption that no one would bother causing trouble in a place like this. "I'll call the police," I said, reaching for my phone in my back pocket. He moved fast, stepping out from behind the shelf and blocking the aisle before I could react. "There's no need for that," he said. His tone was smooth, almost friendly, but his body language was anything but. He was too close, standing just a little too tall, and his eyes never left mine. "I'm just trying to finish my shift," I said, keeping my voice as calm as I could. Please leave. Instead of answering, he took another step forward, forcing me to back up. Do you work here alone? He asked, his head tilting again. It must get lonely. My throat tightened. That's none of your business. He chuckled, low and soft, like I'd said something funny. You're not very friendly, are you? Most people who work in places like this are friendlier. I didn't answer. My phone was still in my pocket, but I didn't want to reach for it again. He was too close, and I didn't want to give him a reason to grab me. My heart was pounding, and I was hyper-aware of how empty the building was, how far I was from the front door. Do you live around here? He asked. It's a small town. I bet you're easy to find. I tried to stay calm, but his words sent a cold rush of fear through me. You need to leave, I said again, my voice sharper now. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow step to the side, forcing me to move further into the corner. The shelves behind me felt like walls, boxing me in. You've got a nice voice, he said, almost like he was complimenting me. I bet people tell you that all the time. I'm calling the police, I said, pulling my phone out and unlocking it with shaking hands. Before I could dial, he lunged forward, grabbing my wrist. Don't, he said, his tone still calm but his grip iron tight. I twisted, trying to pull free, but he held on. Let go! I yelled, my voice echoing through the empty library. He didn't let go, but his smile faded. Calm down, he said. You're overreacting. I didn't care about overreacting. I swung my other hand, hitting his arm as hard as I could. It was enough to loosen his grip, and I yanked my wrist free, stumbling backward. He didn't come after me right away. Instead, he just stood there, his head tilted again like he was trying to figure something out. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. I didn't respond. My back hit the shelf, and I used it to steady myself before darting down the next aisle. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. He wasn't running, but he wasn't letting me out of his sight either. I reached the front desk and grabbed the landline phone, dialing 911 as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the receiver. 911, what's your emergency? The operator said. There's a man in the library, I said, my voice trembling. He won't leave. He's threatening me. Before I could say more, he appeared at the end of the aisle, his face calm but his eyes cold. You really didn't need to do that, he said, stepping closer. They're on their way, I said, holding the phone like a shield. Just leave. He stopped, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might actually listen, but then he took another step forward. You think they'll get here in time? The operator was still talking, but I couldn't focus on her words. My entire body was tense, ready to run if I had to. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on him. Then I heard it, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. His expression changed, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He glanced toward the window, then back at me. You got lucky, he said, his voice low. He turned and walked quickly toward the back of the library, disappearing between the shelves. I didn't wait to see where he went. I ran to the door, unlocking it just as the first police car pulled into the lot. The officers searched the building, but they didn't find him. They said he must have slipped out through the emergency exit before they arrived. They offered to walk me to my car and told me to call if I saw anything suspicious. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying his words, his calm smile, and the way he seemed to know exactly how far he could push without crossing the line. I still don't know what he wanted or why he was there, but I quit the job the next day. It was supposed to be a simple hike, just me in the desert. I had planned it for weeks, a remote trail about 20 miles from the nearest town. I wanted to clear my head, get some exercise, and be alone with my thoughts. The trail wasn't marked well, but I had a GPS and a map, so I wasn't too worried. It was one of those places where you're unlikely to run into anyone else, especially on a weekday. That's exactly why I chose it. I parked my car at a gravel pull-off that barely resembled a parking lot. There were no other vehicles, just my dusty sedan and the endless horizon of red rocks, dry brush, and scattered cacti. It was hot, even though the sun had just risen. The heat rolled off the ground in waves, making everything shimmer. The first couple of miles were uneventful. The trail was rough, more of a suggestion than an actual path, but I managed to follow it. Every now and then, I stopped to take a sip of water and look around. The silence was immense, like the desert swallowed every sound. I liked that. It made me feel small in a way that was humbling. About an hour in, I noticed something odd. There were markings in the dirt, not tracks from animals or boots, but deliberate scratches. They looked like they'd been made with a stick or a knife. They weren't letters, but they weren't random either, more like shapes or symbols. At first, I thought they might be some kind of trail marker, though they didn't look official. The first set was a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun. A few feet further, there was another, this one a triangle with a line through the middle. The symbols continued every few yards, each different but clearly connected. I crouched down to look at one, brushing some of the dirt away with my hand. The edges were sharp, like they'd been made recently. I told myself it was nothing, maybe something left by another hiker or a bored kid. But it didn't sit right with me. The markings felt purposeful, like they were meant to be found. I thought about turning back, but the trail ahead looked clear, and I wasn't ready to give up my hike just because of some weird scratches in the dirt. I kept walking, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped several times to look around, but there was no one. Just the empty desert stretching in every direction. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. About 3 miles in, I saw the first sign of trouble. It was a pile of rocks stacked in a way that didn't look natural, 3 flat stones balanced on top of each other, with another leaning against the base. Next to it, there was a long stick driven into the ground, and hanging from it was a strip of cloth. The cloth was faded, maybe white once, but now more of a yellowish brown. It flapped gently in the hot breeze. I stopped and stared at it for a long time. This wasn't something a casual hiker would leave behind. It felt more like a warning, though for what, I couldn't say. My gut told me to turn around, but I didn't listen. I told myself I was overthinking it. The desert was full of odd things, wind-blown debris, abandoned objects, and strange formations. That didn't mean anything sinister was going on. The trail narrowed as it wound through a rocky canyon. The walls were high on either side, blocking the sun and casting long shadows. The temperature dropped a few degrees, but the air felt heavier, like it was harder to breathe. That's when I heard the voices. At first, they were faint, almost drowned out by the sound of my own footsteps. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The voices were low and indistinct, coming from somewhere ahead. They didn't sound like hikers. There was no laughter, no casual chatter, just murmuring, like a conversation in a language I couldn't understand. I stepped off the trail, moving as quietly as I could. My boots crunched against the gravel, and I winced at the noise. I climbed a small rise and crouched behind a boulder, peeking over the edge. There were 4 of them, all men. They stood in a loose circle, dressed in mismatched clothing, jeans, camo pants, t-shirts, and jackets despite the heat. 2 of them had rifles slung over their shoulders. The other 2 carried pistols holstered at their hips. They were focused on something in the center of their group, though I couldn't see what it was. One of them knelt down, his back to me, and the others leaned in closer, their voices low and urgent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they might hear it. I knew I shouldn't be there, that I needed to back away quietly and leave before they saw me. But I couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen, my brain caught between fight and flight but unable to decide. Then one of them looked up. He was tall and lean, with a shaved head and a scruffy beard. His eyes scanned the canyon, and for a moment, they passed right over me. I thought I was safe, but then his gaze snapped back, locking onto my hiding spot. He said something to the others, and they all turned to look. "Hey," the bald man shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. "Come out." I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed still, they'd think they were imagining things. "I see you," he yelled. "Get over here, now." The others spread out, their hands hovering near their weapons. I knew I couldn't run. There was nowhere to go, and they were armed. Slowly, I stood up, raising my hands to show I wasn't a threat. "Easy," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm just hiking." The bald man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "This is private property," he said. "You're trespassing." "I didn't know," I said quickly. The trail map didn't say anything about private land. "I'll leave right now." He shook his head. Too late for that. The man who had been kneeling stood up, and I saw what they'd been looking at, a large, jagged symbol carved into the dirt. It was fresh, the edges sharp and clean, just like the ones I'd seen earlier. "What are you doing out here?" another man asked, his voice harsh. "Hiking," I repeated. "That's all." The bald man took another step closer, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. "You see anything you shouldn't have?" "No," I said. "I swear." They didn't believe me. I could see it in their faces, the way they exchanged glances. One of them pulled a pistol from his holster, holding it loosely at his side. My stomach dropped. "Give me your pack," the bald man said. "What?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Your pack," he repeated. "Hand it over." I slid the straps off my shoulders and held it out. He snatched it from me and dumped the contents onto the ground: water bottles, snacks, a first aid kit, and my GPS. He picked up the GPS and turned it over in his hands. "You tracking something?" he asked, his tone accusing. "No," I said. "It's just for navigation." He tossed it to the ground and stepped on it, the screen shattering under his boot. My heart sank. "You're going to come with us," he said, motioning for me to move toward the group. "I don't want any trouble," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll leave and never come back." "You already caused trouble," he said. "Now move." I didn't have a choice. They surrounded me, their weapons visible, and led me deeper into the canyon. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but there was nothing. I was at their mercy, and I didn't know what they wanted or how far they were willing to go. The sun was setting, the shadows growing longer as we walked. I knew I had to do something before it got dark. If they took me any further, I might never get out. My chance came when we rounded a bend, the path narrowing between two large rocks. I stumbled, letting myself fall to the ground. One of the men bent down to grab me, and I swung my leg, kicking him hard in the knee. He shouted in pain, and I used the distraction to scramble to my feet and run. The others yelled, their voices echoing through the canyon. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The sound of gunfire rang out, a sharp crack that made me flinch, but I kept going. I don't know how long I ran. The terrain tore at my boots and clothes, but I didn't stop until I saw the glint of my car in the distance. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, peeling out onto the dusty road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the police, but they didn't find anything when they searched the area. No men, no symbols, nothing. I haven't been hiking since. I got off work late that night. It wasn't unusual. My job often kept me up past regular hours. The office was only about a 15-minute walk from my apartment building, but it had been raining, and the streets were slick and quiet. Even the usual distant hum of traffic was muted. I held my bag close to my side and hurried along the damp pavement. By the time I reached the building, my hair was sticking to my forehead, and my shoes were wet through. The lobby was empty, which wasn't surprising. It was a small building, only 6 floors, with just a few apartments on each level. The landlord didn't bother with security cameras, and the front door's lock had been finicky for months. Sometimes it caught, sometimes it didn't. Tonight, it hadn't. I pushed the door open easily and stepped inside. The elevator was at the far end of the hall. I walked toward it, listening to the echo of my footsteps on the tile floor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, their cold glow making everything feel washed out. When I pressed the call button, the doors opened immediately. Someone was already inside. It was a man. Late 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a gray hoodie and jeans. He was leaning against the back wall, staring at the floor, but he looked up when I stepped in. His face was unremarkable, short dark hair, clean-shaven, tired eyes. He gave me a small, polite nod, and I returned it, then pressed the button for my floor. "Late night?" he asked. I nodded, not really wanting to talk. He didn't seem dangerous, but something about him put me on edge. Maybe it was the fact that I didn't recognize him. I'd lived in the building for 3 years, and I knew everyone who lived there, even if only in passing. This man wasn't one of them. "You live here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Just moved in," he said, smiling faintly. "4th floor." "Oh," I said, glancing at the panel. The button for the 4th floor was already lit. "Welcome, I guess." "Thanks," he said. "It's a nice place." Quiet. The elevator jolted slightly as it started moving. I stared at the doors, counting the seconds until I could step off. He didn't say anything else, but I could feel his eyes on me. The air in the small space felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest. When the elevator stopped on the 4th floor, I almost expected him to linger, but he stepped out without hesitation. "Good night," he said over his shoulder. I nodded again, relieved when the doors closed behind him. The elevator continued up to my floor, and I walked quickly to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I set my bag down and leaned against the door, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The encounter had been harmless, I told myself. I was just tired, and my nerves were playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. Something about him didn't feel right. I tried to distract myself by going through my usual routine, changing into pajamas, reheating leftovers, and scrolling aimlessly on my phone. But the quiet of my apartment felt oppressive, every creak and groan of the old building making me jump. I told myself it was nothing, just paranoia. It wasn't until the next morning that I thought to ask my neighbor about the new tenant. Mrs. Calder lived directly across the hall, and she knew everything about everyone in the building. If someone had moved in, she'd know. When I knocked on her door, she opened it almost immediately, her expression brightening when she saw me. "Good morning, dear," she said. "What can I do for you?" "Morning," I said. "I just wanted to ask, did someone new move in on the 4th floor?" She frowned, tilting her head slightly. "Not that I've heard." "Why?" "There was a man in the elevator last night," I said. "He said he just moved in." She shook her head. "No one's moved in recently." I'd know if they had. My stomach tightened. "You're sure?" "Positive," she said. "The last person to move in was the young couple on the 2nd floor, and that was months ago." I forced a smile and thanked her, retreating back to my apartment. My mind was racing. If he wasn't a tenant, what was he doing in the building? Maybe he was visiting someone. That was possible, wasn't it? But why lie about living here? The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. When night fell, I found myself dreading the thought of going to sleep. I double-checked the locks on my door and windows, even though I lived on the 5th floor and there was no way anyone could climb up. I left the lights on in the living room, telling myself it was just to make the place feel less empty. Around midnight, I heard a noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. I froze, straining to listen. It came again, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like footsteps on the stairs. I told myself it was nothing, just someone going to their apartment. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until they were right outside my door. Then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting. The silence stretched on, every second feeling like an eternity. Finally, I heard a soft knock. Just once, then nothing. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time. They faded into the distance, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing. The next morning, I decided to leave a note for the landlord about the strange man. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I felt like someone needed to know. I slipped the note under his office door on my way to work, then tried to put it out of my mind. When I got home that evening, there was an envelope taped to my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in messy handwriting. "Why did you tell?" My blood ran cold. I looked up and down the hallway, but there was no one there. My hands were shaking as I unlocked my door and stepped inside, locking it behind me. That night, I heard the footsteps again, this time followed by a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged along the wall outside my apartment. I sat in the dark, clutching my phone, too scared to move. I didn't sleep. When morning finally came, I packed a bag and left. I didn't go to work. I went straight to a hotel and called the police. They checked the building but didn't find anything. No sign of forced entry, no one matching the man's description. I never went back to that apartment. I broke my lease and moved out within a week. Sometimes, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. It was a typical night on the graveyard shift. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, even the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I was the only one stationed at the front desk of the distribution center, the security office tucked into the corner of the massive, mostly empty warehouse. It was always cold, always eerily still at this hour. My job was straightforward: monitor the cameras, log deliveries if any showed up late, and make sure everything was locked up by sunrise. It was around 2:30 in the morning when I first heard the banging. It came from somewhere deep in the warehouse. A solid, rhythmic thudding that echoed through the vast space. At first, I thought it was just the building settling or something shifting on one of the high shelves. Things like that happened all the time. But the sound kept going, steady and deliberate, like someone was pounding on a metal door. I leaned over the desk to check the monitors. The screen showed grainy black and white footage from the security cameras placed around the warehouse. Rows of shelves stretched endlessly, stacked with boxes and pallets. Most of the cameras displayed nothing but stillness. Then I saw it, the feed from the storage room at the back of the building. The door was shaking, the frame rattling violently with each bang. I frowned, trying to remember if anyone was supposed to be working back there. There were only 2 other people on shift that night, Steve, who was running inventory in another section, and Carla, the janitor, who usually stuck to the break room when she wasn't cleaning. Neither of them had any reason to be in the storage room, especially at this hour. That room was always locked, and the only key was kept in the office safe. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, then hesitated. My first instinct was to call Steve or Carla, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. For all I knew, it was just a loose door or a malfunction with the lock. Still, something about the way the banging sounded made my skin crawl. It wasn't random. It was purposeful. "Steve, are you near the storage room?" I asked over the radio. There was a crackle of static before his voice came through. "Nope, I'm over in Section D." "Why?" I didn't want to explain too much and risk sounding paranoid, so I just said, "I heard something." "Might be nothing." "Stay where you are. I'll check it out." The walk to the storage room felt longer than usual. The warehouse's cavernous interior amplified every sound, the scuff of my boots, the faint hum of machinery, and the distant clang of metal. By the time I reached the storage room, the banging had stopped. The door stood perfectly still, as if it hadn't moved at all. I shined my flashlight on the handle and tested it. Locked. The keyhole looked undisturbed, no scratches or signs of tampering. I tried peering through the small reinforced window, but the room was pitch black inside. After a moment, I decided to head back to the office and check the footage again. When I got there, I rewound the camera feed to just before the banging started. For a while, the screen showed nothing unusual. Then, at 2:26 a.m., I saw movement. Someone approached the storage room door from out of frame. It was hard to make out details, but they were wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up over their head. They paused in front of the door, then turned to face the camera. I froze. Whoever it was didn't just glance at the camera, they stared directly into it, as if they knew I was watching. After a few seconds, they reached into their pocket, pulled something out, and leaned down toward the lock. The screen flickered, and the feed cut out for several seconds. When it came back on, the door was shaking violently, and the figure was gone. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I switched to the next camera, scanning for any sign of where the person had gone. That's when I saw Steve. He was on the camera near the break room, walking down the hall. But he wasn't alone. There was someone following him, a man in dark clothes, his face obscured by shadows. I grabbed the radio again, my hand trembling. "Steve, where are you right now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm in Section D, like I said," he replied immediately. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The Steve on the monitor wasn't in Section D. He was heading straight for the storage room. "Stay there," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't move." I switched to the next camera. The fake Steve and the shadowy figure were now standing outside the storage room. Fake Steve pulled a key from his pocket and unlocked the door. He stepped inside, the figure following close behind. My head was spinning. There was no way Steve could be in two places at once. I didn't know who I was watching, but it wasn't him. I checked the live feed from the storage room. The camera inside was positioned in the far corner, giving a wide view of the space. The two figures were there, standing in the middle of the room, facing away from the camera. One of them was holding something long and thin, like a crowbar or a pipe. Then, as if they could sense me watching, they both turned to face the camera. Their faces were blurred, like static on a broken TV, but I could feel their eyes on me. One of them raised a hand and pointed directly at the lens. The feed cut out. I pushed back from the desk, my chest heaving. This couldn't be happening. I grabbed the landline phone and dialed the police, barely able to get the words out. They promised to send someone over immediately, but I didn't feel reassured. Whoever those people were, they were still inside the building, and I was alone. I locked the office door and huddled under the desk, clutching the radio like a lifeline. I didn't tell Steve or Carla what was happening. I didn't know if I could trust anyone anymore. It felt like hours before the police arrived. When they did, I ran out to meet them, my legs barely holding me up. They searched the entire building but found no sign of the intruders. The storage room was empty, its door locked, the key still in the office safe where it should have been. I quit the next day. I never found out who they were or what they wanted, but I still have nightmares about those blurred faces staring into the camera. The first time I noticed the car, I thought nothing of it. It was parked across the street, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. The headlights were off, and the car blended into the darkness. It was late, well past midnight, and I was locking up the house before bed. It wasn't unusual to see cars parked on the street at odd hours, but something about this one caught my attention. Maybe it was the way it was positioned, facing my house directly, or the faint silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel. I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. The next morning, the car was gone. I didn't think about it again until the next night when it was there again, parked in the exact same spot. This time, I stared at it a little longer from the front window. The figure inside didn't move. It was like they were watching, waiting. I told myself it was probably someone visiting a neighbor or just stopping to rest, but a feeling settled in my chest, a heaviness that I couldn't shake. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The car was there again, parked just beyond the streetlight, the driver still sitting inside. I decided to watch for a while, standing behind the curtain so they wouldn't see me. They didn't leave. They didn't even turn the car on. They just sat there, motionless. I could barely make out the shape of their face through the windshield, but I knew they were facing my house. I stayed up later than usual, watching to see if they would leave. Around 2 a.m., the car finally started, and the headlights cut through the darkness. It pulled away slowly, disappearing down the street. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about why someone would sit outside my house for hours without moving. The next morning, I considered calling the police, but what would I even say? A car parked on a public street isn't a crime. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my stomach. That night, I decided to confront them. I left my porch light on and kept the curtains drawn back so I could see the street clearly. Sure enough, the car appeared again, pulling into the same spot just after midnight. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and stepped outside. The air was cold, and the sound of my footsteps seemed louder than usual. As I approached the car, I could see the driver's face more clearly. It was a man, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He had short, dark hair and a pale, almost sickly complexion. His eyes followed me as I walked up to the driver's side window, but he didn't roll it down. He just stared at me, his expression blank. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound firm. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, as if studying me. Finally, he rolled the window down just enough for me to hear him. "You live here, don't you?" he said. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, but there was something off about the way he said it. "Yes, I do," I replied. "Why are you parked here every night?" He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's a quiet street. Nice place to sit and think." "You've been sitting here for hours every night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's making me uncomfortable." He tilted his head, like he was considering my words. "I didn't mean to upset you. I just like the view." "The view of what?" I asked, feeling my throat tighten. "Your house," he said simply. "It's cozy. Feels warm." I took a step back, my heart racing. "You need to leave. If I see you here again, I'll call the police." His smile widened, but it wasn't friendly. "You could call them. But that would be a shame, wouldn't it? What if they couldn't get here in time?" I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said. My hands were trembling, and I clenched them into fists to keep from showing it. "Leave," I said again, more forcefully this time. He rolled the window up without another word, and the car slowly pulled away. I stood there for a long time, watching until the taillights disappeared into the distance. When I went back inside, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one. I stayed up all night, unable to shake the feeling that he'd be back. The next morning, I finally called the police and explained the situation. They said they'd send a patrol car to drive by my street during the night, but there wasn't much else they could do without a license plate or more concrete evidence. That night, the car didn't show up. I thought maybe the patrol car had scared him off, but the following night, he was back. This time, he parked further down the street, just barely visible from my window. I didn't go outside. I just watched, feeling trapped and helpless. The next morning, I noticed something odd. The flowers in the planter by my front door had been trampled, and there were muddy footprints on the porch. My stomach turned as I realized he must have come up to the house during the night. I checked the locks again, but they were all secure. Still, the idea that he'd been so close made me feel sick. I called the police again, but they still couldn't do much. They advised me to install cameras and keep a record of any suspicious activity. I bought a security system that day and set it up, hoping it would be enough to deter him. That night, I stayed up watching the cameras on my phone. Around 1 a.m., the motion sensor went off, and my screen lit up with a live feed from the front yard. He was there, standing just outside the range of the porch light, staring at the house. He didn't move for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he walked up to the front door and bent down, as if examining the lock. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. They arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, he was gone. They searched the area but didn't find anything. The officers told me to stay somewhere else for a few days while they investigated. I packed a bag and went to stay with a friend across town. For a while, I felt safe, but the fear never really went away. Even now, months later, I still check the cameras every night before bed, half expecting to see his face again. It was late, well past midnight when I pulled into that all-night diner. I had been driving for hours, trying to make up some time. The roads were dead, the kind of empty stretches of farmland that never seemed to end. The only thing keeping me company were the occasional headlights from a passing car or the soft hum of the engine. I'd been on the road for so long that I could feel my eyelids getting heavy, so I knew I needed to stop. The diner was one of those places that didn't look like it belonged in the middle of nowhere, but somehow, it still felt like it had been there forever. Neon lights buzzed above the sign, casting a dim glow that illuminated the cracked pavement. I pulled into the parking lot, parked, and killed the engine. Stepping out into the cool night air, I stretched my legs, taking in the smell of diesel and the faint odor of frying food. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me feel like I wasn't completely alone for a little while. I walked into the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly as I entered. There were only a couple of people inside, one old man in a booth near the back, sipping coffee, and the waitress behind the counter, scribbling something on a notepad. I slid into a booth near the window, letting the door shut softly behind me. I wasn't hungry, but I needed the break. The waitress came over, a middle-aged woman with a tired face and a ponytail. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice hoarse, like she'd been working all night. I just waved her off, ordering a black coffee. I don't remember if I'd said anything else, or if she'd asked about my trip. I wasn't really paying attention. Instead, my eyes kept drifting to the man sitting at the counter. He was tall, wearing a black jacket and a baseball cap that pulled low over his face. He was sitting at the counter, just staring straight ahead, not moving, not looking at the menu or anyone around him. Just staring. At first, I thought he was just tired or zoning out, maybe waiting for his food. But then I realized he wasn't looking at anything in particular. His eyes were fixed, locked on me. And he wasn't blinking, not once. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was unsettling, the way he just stared. I tried to focus on my coffee, but every time I glanced up, he was still staring. I'm no rookie when it comes to dealing with strange people. I've seen my fair share of odd behavior on the road. But this was different. There was something cold about him, something that made my stomach twist. The waitress returned with my coffee, and I took a long sip, trying to shake the weird feeling off. I didn't want to get paranoid. It's a small-town diner. People stare. I was just tired, that's all. But it didn't help that the man didn't stop staring, even when the waitress slid a plate of food in front of him. He didn't touch it, just kept watching me. I finished my coffee, paid the bill, and made my way back to the truck. The man was still there, not even moving. The bell above the door jingled again as I stepped outside, and I felt a slight sense of relief when I closed the door behind me. I climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key, and started the engine. It felt good to get back on the road. But then, as I pulled out of the parking lot, I noticed the man's car. It wasn't parked where it had been before. It was behind me now, about 100 feet down the road, the headlights on, slowly following me. My heart skipped a beat. I figured it was nothing at first. Maybe the guy was just leaving. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The road was empty, just me and that damn car, following me at the same speed, not pulling ahead, not dropping back. I tried to ignore it at first, just focused on the dark road ahead. The last thing I wanted to do was look over my shoulder, but after a few miles, I couldn't help it. I glanced in my mirror. The car was still behind me, keeping the same distance. I could feel the tension in my chest tightening. I didn't like it. I knew I was out in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, no other cars on the road, nothing but the occasional farmhouse in the distance. And this car, this guy, was still following me. I didn't know what to make of it. I sped up, trying to put some distance between us. But the car didn't budge. It stayed right behind me, its headlights blinding in the rearview mirror. I could hear the hum of my tires on the asphalt, the sound of the engine, but the longer I drove, the more I felt like something was closing in. My palms started sweating, my grip on the wheel tightening. I glanced in the side mirror. The car was still there. Still following. I made a sudden turn onto a smaller, unmarked road, hoping to lose him. The headlights of the car followed me, not speeding up, not slowing down. It was like he knew exactly where I was going. The more I drove, the more my anxiety grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a coincidence. This guy was following me. Why? What did he want? The road ahead was nothing but farmland, rows of crops stretching out into the night. I could feel the weight of the silence around me. Every mile, every turn, I kept waiting for the car to speed up, to pass me, to do something. But it just kept its distance. It wasn't until I reached a stretch of road that I knew was isolated, no more farms, just empty land stretching for miles, that I finally lost it. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to steady my breathing. The car was still behind me, headlights shining through the darkness like some kind of predator watching its prey. I didn't know what to do. For a moment, I thought about pulling out my phone and calling the police. But I didn't want to draw attention to myself, didn't want him to know I was scared. So, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching in the mirror as the car came closer, then stopped behind me, just a few feet away. Then, the headlights went out. The darkness felt heavier then. My heart was pounding, and I didn't dare turn around. I stayed still, too scared to even breathe. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but the last thing I wanted was for him to get any closer. A few minutes passed, maybe more. I had no idea. It felt like time had stopped. And then, the sound of a door creaking open. I froze. The man was getting out of the car. I started the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care what I had to do, but I wasn't going to sit there and wait for whatever he had in mind. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away from the man, my headlights cutting through the dark road ahead. I didn't look back. Not once. I don't know how long I drove after that. I just kept going, weaving through the empty roads, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror every few seconds. When I finally got to the next town, I stopped at a gas station, got out, and made sure the coast was clear before I took a deep breath. The car didn't follow me that far. I stayed there for a while, just sitting in the truck, trying to calm myself down. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how close I had been to something happening, something I couldn't control. Whatever that guy wanted, I didn't want to find out. I left the gas station eventually, but I didn't see the car again. I made sure to drive all the way to my destination without looking back. The whole experience shook me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I've driven that stretch of road a dozen times since, but I haven't seen that man again. I hope I never do. I decided to take a solo camping trip after weeks of feeling stressed and restless. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but it had been a while. I thought being out in the woods, away from everything, would help clear my head. I chose a spot in a national forest I'd been to once before, far enough from any main roads that it would be quiet, but not so remote that I felt completely cut off. I drove out in the late afternoon, parked my car on the gravel road where the trailhead began, and hiked about 2 miles to a small clearing near a stream. The spot was perfect, flat ground for my tent, trees close enough to hang my food bag, and the soft sound of water in the background. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and spent the evening reading and watching the stars come out. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. I went to bed early that night, feeling relaxed for the first time in weeks. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and fell asleep quickly. When I woke up, it was still dark. I wasn't sure what had woken me at first, but then I noticed a faint flickering light outside the tent. My heart sank. I could see it through the fabric. The fire was burning again. I hadn't left it lit. I was sure I'd put it out completely before going to bed. I always made sure of that when I was camping, especially alone. For a moment, I just lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a gust of wind had stirred up the ashes, reigniting the flames. But it hadn't been windy. I listened carefully, straining to hear any sound other than the crackling fire. The forest was silent, too silent. No crickets, no owls, nothing. I reached for my flashlight, slowly unzipping the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire was burning low, just enough to cast a dim glow over the campsite. And that's when I saw it. My bag, which I'd left zipped up and stowed under the tarp outside, was open. The contents were scattered around. My water bottle, my headlamp, a couple of snacks, they were all lined up in a neat little row on the ground, as if someone had laid them out deliberately. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here. I sat back inside the tent, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but when I reached for it, I realized it wasn't where I'd left it. I always kept it in the side pocket of my bag, and now it was gone. My mind raced. Had I misplaced it? No, I knew I hadn't. Someone had taken it. I forced myself to breathe, trying to think clearly. I couldn't stay in the tent. If someone was out there, they already knew I was here. Sitting and waiting wasn't an option. I grabbed my pocket knife, the only thing I had for protection, and slowly unzipped the tent the rest of the way. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on a large rock about 20 feet away, just at the edge of the firelight. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, watching me. He was dressed in dark clothes, a jacket and jeans, with a hood pulled up over his head. I couldn't make out his face clearly, but I could see the faint glint of his eyes reflecting the firelight. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. He didn't say anything, didn't move. Just sat there, completely still. I wanted to yell, to ask who he was or what he wanted, but my throat felt dry and tight. All I could do was grip the knife and try not to shake. Finally, I found my voice. "What do you want?" I managed to say, though it came out weaker than I intended. He didn't answer. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me, then slowly stood up. He was tall, taller than I'd realized when he was sitting. My legs tensed, ready to run, but he didn't come toward me. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows beyond the firelight. I didn't wait to see if he was really gone. I scrambled to gather my things as quickly as I could. Most of my gear was scattered, but I grabbed what I could: my boots, my jacket, my flashlight. My phone was nowhere to be found. I stuffed everything into my pack haphazardly, keeping the knife in my hand the whole time, and doused the fire with the water I had left. I didn't even bother with the trail. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, trying to put as much distance between myself and the campsite as possible. The forest was pitch black, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Every sound made me jump: the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see him following me, but I never did. It took me nearly an hour to find my way back to the gravel road where I'd parked. When I finally saw my car, I almost cried with relief. But as I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop all over again. The driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it. I always locked it, especially when I was out in the middle of nowhere. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife as I approached the car. The interior light was on, and the seats had been rifled through, my glove compartment open and its contents dumped onto the floor. My spare key, the one I kept hidden under the wheel well, was gone. I didn't stop to think. I got in, slammed the door, and started the car with my main key, which thankfully I still had in my pocket. As I drove away, my headlights swept across the trees, and for a split second, I thought I saw him again, standing just off the road, watching me. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I found a gas station with bright lights and people around. I sat in my car for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had happened. I still don't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he just watched me instead of doing something worse. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. The woods don't feel peaceful anymore. They feel like a place where someone could be watching, waiting, without you even knowing. And the scariest part is that I'll never know why he was there, or if he ever followed me back. The site was pretty quiet after hours. Most of the guys were long gone by 5, but sometimes I stayed late to finish up. I liked the peace, and it gave me a chance to keep things moving so we didn't fall behind. This job was big, new office complex, for stories, and the deadlines were tight. It was just me that night, double-checking the framing on the 3rd floor and making sure the tools were locked up before I left. It was getting dark, but the floodlights we had set up around the perimeter lit the place up pretty good. There was a fence, too, not a tall one, just chain link, but it was enough to keep people out, or so I thought. I was heading down the stairs when I heard it. A clanging sound, like metal on metal, coming from the back of the site. My first thought was that it was one of the guys who'd forgotten something and come back for it. Maybe a hammer or their lunchbox. But then I remembered I'd been the one to lock up the gate earlier, and I hadn't seen anyone else around. I froze on the stairs, listening. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. Like someone had knocked over one of the toolboxes we kept by the scaffolding. My chest felt tight, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had caught something loose. Still, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find for protection, a crowbar leaning against the railing, and started moving toward the noise. The site felt different in the dark. During the day, it was loud, busy, full of life. At night, with just the floodlights casting long shadows over the bare beams and concrete, it felt off. I walked carefully, trying not to make too much noise, until I reached the edge of the 3rd floor and looked down. There was a man near the scaffolding. He wasn't wearing a hard hat or a vest or anything that would make him look like he belonged there. He had on a hoodie with the hood pulled up and jeans, and he was crouched down by one of the locked tool chests. He had something in his hand, a screwdriver maybe, and was working at the lock. "Hey!" I yelled down. My voice sounded louder than I expected, echoing off the empty walls. The man froze, his head snapping up to look at me. For a second, we just stared at each other, and I thought maybe he'd take off. Instead, he stood up slowly, slipping the screwdriver, or whatever it was, into his pocket. I could see his face now, just enough to notice how pale he was under the light. He didn't look scared. If anything, he looked annoyed, like I was the one who wasn't supposed to be there. What are you doing? I shouted. This is private property. You can't be here. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, watching me, his hands in his pockets. Then, almost casually, he started walking toward the base of the scaffolding, heading for the stairs that led up to where I was. My grip on the crowbar tightened. Hey, I'm calling the cops, I said, though my phone was in the trailer, a good 100 yards away. You better leave now. That made him stop, but instead of running, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out. At first, I thought it was the screwdriver again, but then I saw the blade. A knife. It wasn't big, but it looked sharp, and the way he held it told me he knew how to use it. You're not calling anyone, he said, his voice low and steady. Put that down. He gestured at the crowbar with the knife, like he thought I might actually listen. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, but I wasn't about to drop the only thing I had to defend myself. What do you want? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made my stomach turn. Just asking some questions, he said. You work here, right? You'd know about the security. The security? I repeated, not sure if I'd heard him right. He nodded, taking a slow step closer. Yeah. How many cameras you got? Alarms? How often does someone come by at night? I didn't know what to say. I mean, we didn't have much, just the fence and the lights, and maybe the occasional patrol car driving past on the main road. But I wasn't about to tell him that. You need to leave, I said again, trying to sound more confident than I felt. He didn't move, just kept watching me. You sure about that? He said, almost like he was daring me to make a move. I glanced around, trying to figure out my options. The stairs were the only way down from where I was, and he was standing at the base of them. If I tried to run, he could cut me off before I even got halfway. And if I stayed where I was trapped. I tightened my grip on the crowbar and took a step back. I'm serious, I said. Get out of here, or what? He interrupted, his voice sharp now. You think you're gonna stop me with that? I didn't answer. My mouth felt dry, and my hands were sweating so much I was afraid I'd drop the crowbar if I wasn't careful. Then, without warning, he lunged toward the stairs. I panicked, stepping back too quickly and almost losing my balance. My foot caught on something, a piece of rebar or a loose board, and I went down hard, landing on my back. The crowbar slipped out of my hand, clattering to the ground a few feet away. By the time I scrambled to my feet, he was already halfway up the stairs. I grabbed the crowbar again, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold it, and swung it as hard as I could when he got close. I didn't hit him, but it was enough to make him stop. He jumped back, just out of reach, and held up the knife again, his face twisted with anger now. All right, he said, his voice tight. You want to do this the hard way? Fine. Before he could take another step, there was a sudden shout from somewhere below us. A deep voice, angry and loud. Hey! What the hell's going on up there? The guy froze, his head snapping toward the sound. I glanced down and saw a beam of light sweeping across the site. Someone was coming, a security guard, maybe, or one of the guys from the next shift. The man with the knife cursed under his breath, then turned and ran, taking the stairs two at a time. I watched him disappear into the shadows, my heart still racing. By the time the other man reached me, flashlight in hand, the stranger was long gone. I told the guard everything, and he called the cops. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. The tool chest had been tampered with, but nothing was missing. I guess he hadn't had time to grab anything before I caught him. They never found him, as far as I know. I kept working at the site, but I never stayed late again. And I never went anywhere without something to defend myself. The laundromat was always empty at night, which was why I liked going then. I could fold my clothes without someone else's stuff spilling over onto the counter, and I didn't have to fight for the big machines. It was just me, the hum of dryers, and the flickering fluorescent lights. The place wasn't the best, some machines were out of order, and the lock on the front door didn't really work, but it was close to my apartment, and I didn't have to wait in line. That night, I had a lot to do. I'd let my laundry pile up for weeks, and I was halfway through folding when I heard the door swing open. A man walked in. He didn't look like he had laundry. He didn't have a basket or a bag, just his hands stuffed in the pockets of a beat-up jacket. His hood was up, but I could see his face. Pale, scruffy, maybe in his 30s. His eyes darted around the room like he was checking to see if anyone else was there. It was just me. He walked toward me slowly, like he wasn't sure if he should say something. I didn't want to make eye contact, so I focused on folding. Maybe he'd just sit down and wait for someone, or maybe he'd leave. But he didn't. He stopped a few feet away, too close for comfort. "Hey," he said. His voice was low, a little rough. "You got any change?" I shook my head, not looking up. "No, sorry." "You sure?" he asked, like he didn't believe me. He leaned a little closer. I could feel his eyes on me. "I'm sure," I said. My heart was starting to beat faster, but I kept folding. Maybe he'd take the hint and go. Instead, he moved even closer. "That's funny," he said. "You're in a laundromat, and you don't got change?" "I use my card," I said, pointing to the machine on the wall. It wasn't a lie, most of the machines here had card readers. He didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing, shallow and quick. "You lying to me?" he said finally, his voice sharper now. I looked up then, just for a second. His face was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach turn. "I'm not lying," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't have any change." For a moment, I thought he might leave. He stepped back, pulling his hands out of his pockets. But then he turned and walked to the door. I felt a wave of relief until he reached out and locked it. The door didn't lock well from the inside, but it would still take an extra second to open now, and I didn't like the way he did it. Slow. Deliberate. He turned back to me, and his expression had changed. His mouth was twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said. "Think you can take from me and I wouldn't notice?" I froze, my hands still on the shirt I was folding. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie," he snapped, stepping closer again. "I saw you. You took it. I just want it back." I had no idea what he was talking about, but I could feel my chest tightening. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I'm just here to do my laundry." "You're lying," he said again, his voice rising. He was right in front of me now, so close I could see the dirt under his fingernails. "I saw you. You were by the dumpster earlier, right?" "That was you." I shook my head. "No, I wasn't. I just got here." "Don't play dumb with me," he yelled, slamming his hand down on the counter. I flinched, stepping back, but there was nowhere to go. The folding counter was behind me, and he was blocking the way to the door. "Look," I said, trying to stay calm. "I don't know what you think I took, but it wasn't me. I swear." He stared at me for a long moment, his breathing heavy. Then he reached into his pocket again, and my heart stopped. I thought he was going to pull out a weapon, a knife, maybe, or something worse, but instead, he took out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it and held it up. "You recognize this?" he asked. I glanced at it, confused. It looked like a drawing, some kind of map, maybe, with lines and arrows. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I've never seen that before." "Bullshit," he muttered, crumpling the paper back up. "You're lying. You were by the dumpster. I saw you. You took the rest." "The rest of what?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was tight, his fingers cold and rough. "Give it back," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm not leaving until you give it back." I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. "I don't have anything," I said, panic rising in my throat. "Please, let me go." He didn't let go. Instead, he started pulling me toward the door. "We're gonna check," he said. "We're gonna go outside, and you're gonna show me where you hid it." I dug my heels into the floor, trying to stop him, but he was dragging me like I weighed nothing. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. The laundromat was empty, and the street outside was quiet this late. No one was coming to help me. And then I remembered the phone in my pocket. I fumbled for it with my free hand, my fingers shaking so much I almost dropped it. He didn't notice right away, too focused on the door. When I finally got it out, I hit the emergency call button and held it up so he could see. "Let me go, or I'll call the police," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. He froze, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought he might call my bluff. But then he let go of my wrist, shoving me back against the counter. "You're lucky," he muttered, backing toward the door. "You don't know what you're messing with." He unlocked the door and slipped out into the night, disappearing into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, shaking, the phone still in my hand. When I finally felt safe enough to move, I grabbed my clothes, still half folded, and left. I didn't look back. I was at the train station late at night, waiting for the last train to get home. The platform was almost empty, just a couple of people sitting around, spaced out. The air was cold, and I kept my hands in my jacket pockets, trying not to let the chill get to me. The train was supposed to come in about 10 minutes, so I leaned against the wall and stared at the tracks. That's when I noticed him. He wasn't there when I first sat down. I was sure of that. He must have come in quietly because I didn't hear the footsteps. He sat 2 benches down from me, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees. His clothes were dark, the kind of worn-out stuff you don't really notice unless you're looking for it. He had a hood up, but I could see his face, or at least a part of it that wasn't shadowed. Pale, thin, unshaven. At first, I didn't think much of it. People look rough sometimes, especially this late at night. I glanced at him, then looked away, trying not to stare. But then I heard it, the muttering. Soft at first, almost like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out the words, just the low sound of his voice. It wasn't angry, but it wasn't calm either. It had this tone to it, like he was arguing with someone who wasn't there. I shifted uncomfortably and looked at the clock. 8 minutes. I could handle 8 minutes. The muttering got louder. I glanced over again, trying to be subtle. His head was tilted slightly, and he was rubbing his hands together like he was trying to warm them up. But his lips were moving non-stop, and his eyes, they weren't focused on anything. They darted around, quick and nervous, like he was checking for something. Or someone. I looked away again. My gut was starting to twist in that way it does when you know something's off, even if you can't explain it. The muttering stopped for a moment, and I thought maybe he'd noticed me staring. I didn't dare look back. Then I felt it. That strange, crawling sensation you get when you're being watched. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head just slightly, enough to catch him out of the corner of my eye. He was looking right at me. His eyes locked onto mine like he'd been waiting for me to notice. He didn't blink. His mouth wasn't moving anymore, but his hands were still rubbing together, faster now. I turned away quickly, my heart thudding in my chest. 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes. I decided to move. Staying in one spot made me feel too exposed. I stood up and walked toward the far end of the platform, keeping my pace steady, like I wasn't in a hurry. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me. I could almost hear him standing up. I stopped near one of the pillars and leaned against it, trying to act casual. I took out my phone and stared at the screen, not really seeing anything. I was just trying to keep my hands from shaking. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They weren't coming straight toward me. They were wandering, like someone was pacing but didn't want to seem obvious. I glanced up from my phone, and there he was, walking along the edge of the platform. His back was to me, but he wasn't walking away. He was circling. I put my phone back in my pocket and forced myself to breathe. The train would be here soon. All I had to do was wait. But then the footsteps stopped. I looked up again, and he was facing me now, standing still about 20 feet away. His head was tilted, like he was trying to figure something out. His hands were still moving, but now they were fidgeting with something in his pocket. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and walked toward the stairs leading up to the street. I'd call a cab or an Uber. Anything to get me out of there. My footsteps echoed in the empty station, but I could hear his too. He was following me. I sped up, my heart pounding. The stairs were just ahead. I could feel him getting closer, his footsteps quickening to match mine. I broke into a jog, taking the steps 2 at a time. When I reached the top, I glanced back. He was halfway up the stairs, his hood still up, his face shadowed. But I could see his mouth moving again. He was muttering. I didn't wait to hear what he was saying. I ran toward the street, looking for any sign of a cab or a car. The street was mostly empty, just a few parked vehicles and dim streetlights casting long shadows. My phone was in my hand now, and I was trying to pull up a rideshare app, but my hands were shaking so much I could barely type. Then I heard him again. His footsteps were heavier now, faster. He wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. He was running. I turned down an alley, hoping to lose him, but it was a mistake. The alley was narrow, with tall buildings on either side and no way out except the way I came. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to calm my breathing, trying to think. Maybe he'd run past, or maybe he wouldn't follow me in here. But he did. He stopped at the mouth of the alley, his silhouette framed by the streetlights. He stood there for a moment, his head turning slowly as he scanned the darkness. Then he stepped forward, his hands still in his pockets. I didn't wait. I ran to the back of the alley, hoping to find something, an open door, a fire escape, anything. But there was nothing. Just a dead end. His footsteps were getting closer. I turned around, my back to the wall, and faced him. My phone was still in my hand, and I held it up like a weapon. "Stay back," I said, my voice shaking. He stopped, just a few feet away. His face was clearer now under the dim light. His eyes were wide, his pupils dark and unsteady. His mouth twitched as he spoke, his voice low and sharp. "You took it," he said. "You know you did." "I didn't take anything," I said. "I don't even know you." He didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. The blade caught the light, and my stomach dropped. He held it low, his grip tight. "Give it back," he said, stepping closer. I didn't think. I just acted. I threw my phone at him, hitting him in the shoulder. It startled him just enough for me to push past him and run back toward the street. I could hear him yelling behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran out of the alley and into the road, waving my arms at an oncoming car. The car screeched to a stop, and the driver rolled down the window, looking confused. "Help me," I gasped. "Please, help me." The driver must have seen the fear on my face because they unlocked the door without asking any questions. I jumped in, slamming the door behind me, and looked back. The man was standing at the edge of the alley, his knife still in hand. He didn't follow me this time. He just stood there, watching as the car pulled away. I didn't look back again. I didn't stop shaking until I was home. It happened late one night when I was driving home from a friend's place. I'd stayed later than I meant to, and by the time I left, the roads were empty. I decided to take a back road to save some time, even though it wasn't well lit. I'd driven it before, and it was usually quiet, just a stretch of dark trees and the occasional curve. I figured I'd be home in less than an hour if I kept a steady pace. The first time I saw the car, it was parked on the side of the road with its hazards on. The flash of the orange lights caught my attention as I rounded a bend. The car was pulled off onto the shoulder, slanted awkwardly like it had been left in a hurry. There was a man standing next to it, waving his arms. I slowed down just a little, squinting to get a better look. He looked scruffy, like he'd been out there for a while. His clothes were loose and rumpled, and his hair was messy, sticking out from under a baseball cap. He waved at me again, stepping closer to the road. Something about him made my stomach turn. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the way he moved, quick and jerky, or the way he kept glancing around like he was checking for something. I didn't stop. I swerved a little to give him space and kept driving. In my mirror, I saw him lower his arms and just stand there, watching my car disappear. It gave me a weird feeling, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe his car really was broken down, and he was just hoping someone would stop and help. Still, I locked my doors and pressed a little harder on the gas. A couple of miles passed, and I started to relax. The road was straight, and there wasn't much to see except the occasional deer darting off into the woods. I turned on the radio to fill the silence, keeping the volume low so I could still hear the hum of the engine. Then I noticed headlights behind me. They weren't there before, I was sure of that. I checked my mirror again, thinking it might be another car that had come up from a side road. But it wasn't just another car. It was the same one I passed. I recognized the shape of it, the way the hazards had flashed unevenly when I'd driven by. The car stayed back at first, keeping a steady distance. I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone who'd managed to get their car running again. But then the headlights turned off. My hands tightened on the wheel. The road ahead was dark, and without the glare of his lights, it was like he'd disappeared. I glanced in the mirror again, but I couldn't see him anymore. Just blackness. I tried to focus on driving, telling myself it didn't mean anything. Maybe he just turned them off because he didn't want to blind me. People did that sometimes, right? But the hair on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. I kept checking the mirror, squinting into the dark. I thought I saw a shape back there, faint and blurry, but I couldn't be sure. Then I felt it. The rumble of another engine, close enough to vibrate through my car. He was tailing me now, close enough that I could see the outline of his car in the faint moonlight. His lights stayed off. I pressed on the gas, picking up speed. The road was narrow, with sharp turns that made my stomach lurch. I didn't want to go too fast and lose control, but I couldn't just let him stay there. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the radio anymore. I reached for the dial and turned it off, the silence making everything feel sharper, louder. The car behind me sped up to match my pace. He stayed right on my bumper, close enough that I could almost feel him pushing me forward. I thought about slamming on the brakes, but I was too scared of what he'd do if I stopped. My hands were shaking now, slippery with sweat as I gripped the wheel. Another turn came up, and I took it too fast, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel. The car behind me didn't slow down. If anything, he got closer. I could see his silhouette in the driver's seat now, dark and motionless. I spotted a narrow driveway up ahead, barely visible through the trees. I made a snap decision and veered into it, hoping to lose him. The driveway was rough, bouncing my car as I sped down it. I could feel every rock and dip, the jolt rattling through my teeth. My headlights lit up an old gate at the end, chained shut. There was nowhere to go. I slammed on the brakes and turned off the engine, killing the lights. My chest was heaving, my breaths loud and uneven. I ducked down in my seat, trying to make myself small. Through the rear window, I saw his car slow as it passed the driveway. He must have noticed me turn off because he stopped in the middle of the road, just sitting there. I couldn't see him anymore, but I knew he was there. My car felt like a trap, too small and too exposed. I didn't dare move, barely even breathing as I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. Then I heard it, the crunch of gravel under tires. He was backing up, inching closer to the driveway. I sank lower in my seat, my fingers digging into the fabric of the door. The sound stopped, and I saw the faint glow of his headlights again as he pulled into the driveway behind me. Panic flooded my chest. I reached for my phone, but my fingers were trembling too much to get a grip on it. I dropped it between the seats, the clatter loud in the stillness. I didn't dare reach down to grab it. His car stopped about 20 feet away, and the engine went silent. I could hear him getting out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He moved slowly, deliberately, like he knew I was watching. His shape appeared in the faint moonlight, tall and angular, his head turning as he scanned the area. I couldn't stay in the car. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could and slipped out, keeping low. The trees were thick on either side of the driveway, their shadows stretching long and dark across the ground. I crept toward them, trying not to make a sound. Behind me, I heard him muttering. Low and steady, like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone sent a chill through me. I pressed into the trees, crouching behind a thick trunk. My legs were shaking, and my breath was coming too fast. I clamped a hand over my mouth, trying to stay quiet. He walked past my car, his boots scraping against the gravel. His muttering grew louder, angrier, but I still couldn't make out the words. He stopped near the gate, his head turning toward the woods. I thought for sure he'd seen me. Then his voice changed. He was yelling now, loud and sharp, the words still jumbled and incoherent. He kicked at the gate, the metal rattling in the quiet. I stayed frozen, too scared to move. After what felt like hours, he finally turned back toward his car. His footsteps were slower now, his muttering quieter. I heard the car door slam, and the engine roared to life. The headlights came on, lighting up the driveway for a brief, terrifying moment. Then he reversed back onto the road and sped away. I stayed hidden in the woods until I couldn't hear the engine anymore. When I finally got the courage to move, I crawled back to my car, my legs so weak I could barely stand. My phone was still wedged between the seats, and I fumbled to pull it out, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. By the time the police arrived, he was long gone. I gave them a description, but I didn't even know what he looked like. Just his car, his muttering, and the way he chased me like I was something he needed to catch. I went for a run late that night. It was later than I usually go, but I'd been stuck inside all day, and I needed to clear my head. The park near my apartment has a paved loop that's just over a mile long, with dim lights spaced out along the trail. It's not the kind of place I hang out in after dark, but for running, I figured it would be fine. I'd done it before. The first couple of laps were normal. It was quiet, and the only sound was my shoes hitting the pavement and my own breathing. There was a breeze, cool enough to cut through the sticky air. A few lights flickered as I passed under them, but I didn't think much of it. That happened all the time. It was on my third lap that I noticed him. He was standing off to the side, near one of the benches under a street lamp. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, maybe just resting. He didn't look like he was there to jog. He was wearing a hoodie and jeans, too heavy for running. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, hands in his pockets. I kept going, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. I felt him watching me as I passed, but I didn't look back. Something about him made my chest tighten, though I couldn't explain why. There wasn't anything outright threatening about him. It was just the way he stood so still, like he was waiting for something. On the next lap, he was in the same spot. Same position, same stillness. I noticed his hood was up this time, covering most of his face. I thought maybe I was overthinking it. It's a public park, after all. He had just as much right to be there as I did. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was there because of me. I kept running, trying not to let it get to me. My legs were starting to burn, but I didn't want to stop. I figured I'd finish one more loop and head home. When I came around again, he wasn't by the bench anymore. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. My eyes darted around as I ran, searching the shadows, but I didn't see him. I told myself he'd probably left, gone back to wherever he came from. Still, my pace quickened, my breath coming in shorter bursts. I decided to change my route, just to be safe. There's a side path that cuts through a wooded section of the park, leading out to a residential street. It's darker there, with only a couple of lights near the entrance. I figured if I took that path, I could avoid going past the bench again. As I turned onto the side path, the hairs on my neck stood up. I don't know what made me do it, but I glanced over my shoulder. He was there, standing in the middle of the trail behind me, just far enough back that I hadn't heard him approach. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. I didn't stop. My heart was pounding now, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run faster. I told myself not to panic. Maybe he was just taking the same path. Coincidence, I thought. It had to be. But then I saw him again, up ahead this time. He was standing at the edge of the trail, right where the path narrowed into the woods. My feet slowed on their own, my body frozen in place. It didn't make sense. There was no way he could have gotten there that fast. I hadn't even heard him pass me. He stepped onto the path, blocking it completely. His hood was still up, and I couldn't see his face in the dim light. He raised one hand, palm out, like he was telling me to stop. I backed up a few steps, my breathing ragged. My eyes darted around, looking for another way out, but the woods were thick on either side. There was nowhere to go but back the way I came. "Hey," I called out, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" He didn't answer. He didn't move. Just stood there, his hand still raised. I turned and ran. My legs felt like lead, every step heavier than the last. The path blurred around me, the trees closing in. I didn't dare look back, not until I was back on the main trail. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the path was empty. He wasn't following me, but I didn't feel safe. I didn't stop running, even when my lungs burned and my vision started to blur. I kept going until I was out of the park, my feet pounding against the pavement of the residential street. The street lights here were brighter, and the sound of my own breathing seemed louder, echoing in the stillness. I reached my apartment building and fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock the door. Once I was inside, I locked it behind me and pressed my back against it, my chest heaving. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe he was just trying to scare me. Or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I'll never run in that park again. I had booked the place online because it was cheap and had decent reviews. It wasn't my first time using a shared Airbnb, so I knew the drill. I wasn't expecting anything fancy, just a quiet room to crash in while I attended a conference in the city. The house itself was older, a 2-story place with creaky floors and old wallpaper that felt like it hadn't been updated in decades. It was a little rundown but clean enough, and the owner seemed friendly when he handed me the key to my room. He showed me around briefly, explaining that I'd be sharing the house with 2 other guests who were staying in the upstairs rooms. My room was on the ground floor, tucked away at the end of a narrow hallway. It had a bed, a small desk, and a closet. Nothing fancy, but I didn't need much. The door locked from the inside, and the windows faced a small backyard with overgrown grass. That first night was uneventful. I heard footsteps upstairs now and then, and the faint murmur of voices, but it wasn't anything that bothered me. I locked my door, went to bed, and woke up the next morning feeling rested. The owner wasn't around when I left for the conference, but I figured he was upstairs or out running errands. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed the camera. I'd come back to the house around 8, tired from the day, and decided to take a shower before settling in. The bathroom was down the hall from my room, shared with the other guests. I grabbed my things and headed in, locking the door behind me. As I was brushing my hair, I noticed a small red light blinking from the corner near the ceiling. At first, I thought it was just part of a smoke detector, but the angle seemed wrong. When I looked closer, my stomach dropped. It was a camera. It wasn't hidden well, just mounted up high where it could easily be missed if you weren't looking for it. I froze for a second, staring at it, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen anything in the listing about cameras, and it wasn't pointed at the door, it was angled toward the shower. My heart started racing as I grabbed my things and went back to my room. I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm down. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a security thing the owner had forgotten to mention. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt wrong. I decided to check my room, just in case. I went through everything, pulling back the curtains, checking the corners of the ceiling, even looking under the bed. That's when I found it. There was another camera, this one tucked inside the vent above the desk. It was small, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for, but once I saw it, there was no mistaking it. I felt sick. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and dialed the owner's number. He picked up after a few rings, sounding surprised to hear from me. "There's a camera in my room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And another one in the bathroom. What the hell is going on?" There was a pause on the other end. Then he sighed, like I'd caught him in some harmless mistake. "Oh, I'm so sorry about that," he said. "Those are old security cameras from the previous owner. They're not active anymore, I just haven't had a chance to take them down." I didn't believe him. The light on the bathroom camera had been blinking. I told him as much, but he brushed it off, insisting it must have been a malfunction. He sounded calm, almost too calm, like he'd rehearsed the excuse 100 times. I wanted to leave right then, but it was late, and I didn't have anywhere else to go. I figured I'd stay the night with the door locked and leave first thing in the morning. I pushed the desk against the door for good measure and kept my phone close. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was trying not to make too much noise. I sat up in bed, every nerve in my body on edge. The footsteps stopped outside my door. Then the handle rattled. Whoever it was tried it once, twice, then harder, like they were testing to see if the lock would hold. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, whispering my address to the operator. The rattling stopped, and I heard the footsteps retreat down the hall. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until I heard the sound of a door creaking open upstairs. The police showed up about 15 minutes later. I stayed on the phone with the operator until I heard the knock at the front door. When I let them in, I explained everything: the cameras, the footsteps, the owner's weird excuse. They searched the house and found the cameras, along with a laptop in the owner's room that had live feeds from all of them. The other guests had already left earlier in the evening, so it was just me and the owner in the house. He was nowhere to be found. They eventually caught him a few days later. Turns out he'd been renting out the house for months, filming guests without their knowledge. I was lucky to get out when I did. I had planned the trip for months. A small cabin by the lake, just me and my fishing gear, miles away from anyone or anything. It was perfect. The cabin was basic: wooden walls, a single bed, a small kitchen, and a bathroom that barely worked. But it had a dock and a boat, and that's all I really cared about. I wanted peace, just the sound of the water and the wind. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I spent most of the time on the lake, catching small fish and enjoying the quiet. I hadn't seen another soul since I'd arrived. It felt like the whole place was mine. The sun would go down, and I'd sit on the dock with a beer, watching the stars. The kind of calm that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. On the third day, I went out early, just as the sun was rising. The water was calm, a perfect mirror of the sky. I steered the boat out toward the middle of the lake and dropped my line, sitting back and waiting. A couple of hours passed, and I decided to head back for lunch. As I got closer to the dock, I noticed something strange. Another boat was tied up next to mine. It wasn't there when I left. It wasn't a fancy boat, just an old aluminum one with peeling paint. But it was strange to see because I hadn't noticed anyone else around the lake. I scanned the shore, looking for signs of someone, footprints, a fishing rod, anything, but there was nothing. Just the boat, sitting there like it had always been. I stood on the dock for a while, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe it belonged to someone from further down the lake, someone who had wandered over and tied up for a break. But why not knock on the cabin door? And where were they now? I shook it off. It was probably nothing. I told myself I was overthinking it and went inside to make a sandwich. The rest of the day felt off, though. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to walk out of the woods or show up on the dock. But no one came. By the time the sun started setting, I was uneasy. I went back out to check the boat again. It hadn't moved, still tied up like it had been there for years. I thought about untying it, letting it drift, but something about the idea didn't sit right. What if the owner came back looking for it? I decided to leave it alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me sit up, listening. The creak of the cabin settling, the wind in the trees, it all felt too loud, too close. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal. But these were too steady, too deliberate. They crunched on the gravel path outside, circling the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped right outside my window. I didn't have curtains, just an old sheet draped over the rod. I could see the outline of someone standing there, the faintest shadow against the moonlight. They didn't move. They just stood there. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I reached for my phone, but then I remembered no service out here. I didn't even have a landline. I was completely cut off. After what felt like hours, the shadow finally moved. The footsteps started again, heading toward the dock. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then crept to the window and peeked out. The other boat was gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the corner of the cabin with a kitchen knife, every sound making me jump. When the first light of morning came, I felt a little braver. I went outside, looking for any sign of who had been there. The gravel path was covered in footprints, but they were too scattered to tell which way they came from or went. I walked down to the dock, half expecting to see the boat tied up again. It wasn't. But there was something else. A small pile of fish, gutted and cleaned, sat on the dock. I hadn't caught them. I stared at them for a long time, my stomach turning. It felt like some kind of message, but I didn't know what it meant. I decided then and there that I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my things, loaded them into the boat, and started heading back toward the small marina where I'd parked my truck. As I got closer to the shore, I noticed something else. A man was standing on the edge of the trees, just watching me. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the outline of him, tall and still. I didn't stop to find out who he was. I gunned the boat's motor and didn't look back until I was halfway across the lake. When I finally turned around, he was gone. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. I don't even know if he was alone. But I know I'll never go back to that lake. It was late, maybe around 11:30 p.m. The store was dead quiet like it usually was on weeknights. I worked the night shift at a small convenience store just off the highway, mostly stocking shelves, cleaning, and ringing up the occasional traveler who needed gas or snacks. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked the solitude most nights. I was behind the counter checking the expiration dates on a box of candy bars when I noticed him. He'd come in without a sound, no bell from the door chime or anything. Just there, standing by the drink coolers at the back of the store. I don't even know how long he'd been there before I looked up. He was tall, maybe mid-30s, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his face and a dark jacket that looked too big for him. He wasn't holding anything, just standing there like he was browsing but not really looking at anything. At first, I thought maybe he was trying to decide on a drink or something, so I went back to my task. After a few minutes, I glanced up again. He hadn't moved, still standing in the same spot with his back to me. Something about it felt off. People don't usually linger in a convenience store for long, especially not at that hour. I cleared my throat, more to make myself feel less awkward than to get his attention. "Let me know if you need any help," I said. He didn't respond. Didn't even turn around. Just kept standing there. The air felt heavier after that, like the silence in the store was pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just indecisive or shy. I went back to what I was doing, but I couldn't focus. Every few seconds, my eyes would flick back to him. He still hadn't moved. Finally, I decided to break the tension. "Looking for anything in particular?" I asked, louder this time. My voice echoed more than I expected, and it made me flinch. This time, he moved. Slowly, he turned his head toward me, but not all the way. I couldn't see his face clearly under the brim of his hat, just the faint glint of his eyes catching the fluorescent lights. He didn't say anything, just looked at me for a moment before turning back to the cooler. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I told myself he was probably harmless, just weird or socially awkward. But I couldn't ignore the way my instincts were screaming at me. Something about him felt wrong. Eventually, he grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and walked up to the counter. His steps were slow and deliberate, almost like he was dragging them. He set the bottle down and stood there, not saying a word. I rang it up, trying to keep my hands steady. "That'll be $1.79, I said, forcing a smile. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled $5 bill. His hand lingered on the counter a moment longer than necessary before letting go of the money. I gave him his change, which he didn't take. He just stood there, staring at me. "Do you need a bag?" I asked, my voice shaky now. He shook his head, grabbed the bottle, and walked toward the door. But he didn't leave. He stopped just inside the doorway, standing with his back to me again, like he was looking at the rack of brochures for nearby attractions. I felt trapped. I couldn't just ask him to leave. It wasn't against the rules to hang around the store. But I didn't want him there. I couldn't focus on anything else, couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me even when his back was turned. After what felt like forever, he finally walked out. The bell above the door jingled as he left, and I exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. I walked to the window and watched him. He didn't get into a car or walk down the highway. He just stood in the parking lot, leaning against the light post with his bottle of water in one hand, staring at the store. I tried to ignore him and focus on closing up. I locked the doors at midnight, counted the cash in the register, and shut off most of the lights. But when I looked out the window again, he was still there, just standing under the dim glow of the parking lot light. I couldn't leave while he was out there. My car was parked on the far side of the lot, and the thought of walking past him made my skin crawl. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? A guy bought a bottle of water and stood in the parking lot. It wasn't illegal to hang around. I waited another 20 minutes, hoping he'd leave, but he didn't. If anything, he'd moved closer to my car. Eventually, I couldn't wait any longer. I grabbed my keys and my phone, stuffed them into my pocket, and walked to the door. I unlocked it, stepped outside, and locked it again behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. He didn't move at first, just watched as I walked toward my car. I kept my eyes straight ahead, my pace quick but not frantic. When I got about halfway there, I heard him shift behind me, the scuff of his shoes against the asphalt. "Hey," he called out. His voice was low and rough, the kind that didn't invite conversation. I ignored him and kept walking. "Hey," he called again, louder this time. "I'm talking to you." I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the lock. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him walking toward me now, his steps faster and more deliberate. "Wait," he shouted, and I could hear the anger in his voice now. "You took something from me." I didn't wait to find out what he meant. I yanked the door open, jumped in, and locked it behind me. As I started the car, he reached the driver's side window and slammed his hand against it. The sound made me scream. "You took it," he yelled, his face twisted with rage. I still couldn't make out his features clearly in the dim light, but I could see his teeth, clenched and bared like an animal. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the parking spot as fast as I could. He pounded on the window again, harder this time, but I didn't stop. I shifted into drive and sped out of the lot, not looking back. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and sat in the middle of the living room, shaking. I don't know what he wanted or what he thought I'd taken, but I've never been so scared in my life. I quit the job the next day. It was late when I decided to take the back road home. I'd stayed longer than I planned at the office, and the idea of a straight, quiet drive with no traffic sounded good. The road stretched for miles through empty farmland, nothing but fields and a few patches of trees on either side. The kind of place where you could drive for ages without seeing another car. It was colder than usual for that time of year, and the sky was clear, stars out bright against the darkness. My high beams cut through the emptiness, showing nothing ahead but asphalt and the occasional animal darting across. I wasn't in a hurry, just coasting, half listening to the radio when I saw it, someone standing at the edge of the road. At first, I thought I imagined it. People didn't just stand out there in the middle of nowhere. But as I got closer, I saw the figure waving both arms over their head. A car was pulled over on the shoulder behind them, its hood popped open. My stomach sank. I didn't want to stop. Everything about it felt wrong, but it was late, and they might genuinely need help. I slowed down as I approached, rolling the window down just enough to hear over the engine. The person, a man, came closer. He was older, maybe mid-40s, wearing a dirty jacket and jeans. His face was weathered, but not threatening, at least not at first glance. "Car trouble?" I asked, keeping my hand on the gear shift. I didn't like the way he kept glancing past me, like he was looking for something behind my car. "Yeah," he said, his voice uneven, like he was out of breath. "Battery's dead, I think. Won't start. Can you give me a jump?" I hesitated. I hadn't seen anyone else on the road all night, and the area wasn't exactly a hot spot for traffic. It seemed odd for him to be out there alone. My eyes flicked to the car. It was old, beat up, and covered in dirt, like it had been there for longer than he wanted me to believe. Something about the whole thing felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could answer, I saw movement. From the corner of my eye, two figures stepped out of the trees on the opposite side of the road. They were walking quickly toward my car, their silhouettes just barely visible in the dim light. My throat tightened. "Friends of yours?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked. The man in the jacket looked over his shoulder and then back at me, his expression tightening. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the driver's side, resting a hand on the top of the open window. "Hey, don't worry about them," he said, his tone too smooth now, too rehearsed. "They're just helping me out. Can you give us a hand? Won't take a minute." My pulse was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Everything about this screamed trap. I glanced at the two men approaching. One was holding something long and thin, a crowbar or a pipe maybe. The other was reaching into his jacket. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. My foot slammed on the gas, and the car lurched forward. The man at my window yelled, jumping back as I swerved onto the road. The tires screeched as I straightened out, my hands gripping the wheel so tight they hurt. In the rearview mirror, I saw them running after me, the two from the trees waving their arms. One of them threw something. It bounced off the trunk with a loud thud, but I didn't stop to see what it was. My heart was racing as I sped down the road, my eyes darting between the mirror and the dark stretch ahead. I kept expecting to see headlights behind me, a vehicle chasing me down, but the road stayed empty. I didn't slow down until I saw lights in the distance, a small diner that was somehow still open that late. I pulled into the parking lot, shaking as I put the car in park. My hands were trembling so badly I couldn't turn the key to shut off the engine. Inside, the place was quiet except for a couple of truckers sitting at the counter. I sat in a booth near the window, my back to the wall so I could see the entrance. The waitress brought me coffee, and I barely managed to thank her. I sat there for almost an hour, staring out at the road, expecting them to show up. They never did. When I finally felt calm enough to leave, I asked one of the truckers if he'd seen anyone on the road. He shook his head and said it was quiet all night. I took the main highway the rest of the way home. I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if I'd gotten out of the car. Whatever those men wanted, it wasn't just a jump for their battery. I'm sure of that. It was one of those perfect winter days, or at least that's what I thought when I first got to the ski resort. The sky was clear, the sun shining brightly, and the air was crisp but not too cold. The kind of day you look forward to when you've been cooped up all week, waiting for your chance to get out and hit the slopes. It was the middle of the afternoon when I decided to take the lift up to one of the higher runs. It was a little later than I usually go, but I thought I could squeeze in a few more runs before the sun started to dip. I was alone, but that wasn't anything unusual. I prefer skiing by myself anyway. There's something calming about it, just the sound of skis carving into the snow and the wind rushing past your ears. It had been a good day so far, and I was looking forward to getting in a few more runs before heading home. The lift was one of those old ones. The kind that doesn't have safety bars or anything. Just a big metal seat with a couple of thick straps. The kind you have to hop onto and hope you don't fall. Not the most comfortable lift, but it wasn't anything I hadn't dealt with before. I had made it to the top of the hill without issue, enjoying the ride up, when something went wrong. The lift stopped suddenly, without warning. 1 minute, I was moving smoothly up the mountain, and the next, everything just came to a halt. It wasn't like the usual pauses where the operator stops it to let someone on or off. This was different. There was no sound, no movement. Just stillness. I figured it was a mechanical issue. These lifts are old, so it's not uncommon for them to get stuck from time to time. But I wasn't in a rush. I had plenty of time, so I just settled back in and waited. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured they'd get it going again soon enough. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel the cold creeping in. The wind had picked up a little, and I could feel the chill on my face and hands. My nose was starting to run, and my fingers felt stiff. I tugged my gloves tighter, but the cold seemed to be seeping through everything. I looked down at the base of the lift, hoping to see someone coming to fix the issue. The snow was still coming down lightly, but I could barely make out any movement down there. There were a few skiers down below, but nobody seemed to be paying attention to the lift. Not a single person was looking up, which I found strange. Usually, people notice when the lift stops, especially when it's been stopped for more than a few minutes. I started to feel an uneasy feeling in my stomach. It wasn't just the cold anymore, it was something else. Something about the stillness. The fact that no one was responding. The fact that the lift had been stopped for so long and no one seemed to be coming to help. I looked over at the operator's booth. It was empty. That's when it hit me. I don't know why I didn't think of it earlier, but now it was clear to me. The operator had to have seen that the lift had stopped. And yet, they hadn't done anything. No one was coming to fix it. It was as if they had just left me up here on purpose. I looked at my watch. 15 minutes had passed since the lift had stopped. It didn't make sense. I had never been stuck up here this long before. The lifts always get moving again quickly, even if there's a problem. This was different. Something was wrong. I started to feel the cold sinking deeper into my bones. I tried to shift in my seat, but there was no escaping it. The wind had picked up, and I could feel the snow starting to fall more heavily. I looked around, but there was no sign of any other skiers nearby. I hadn't seen any workers come by. No one had even stopped to check on me. The only sound was the wind whistling past the lift cables. I don't know why, but I tried to call the resort's emergency number. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my phone, but when I checked the signal, I realized it was gone. No bars. No service. That's when I started to panic. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. It was probably nothing. They were probably just dealing with a malfunction and hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized how isolated I was. The lift didn't go anywhere near the other parts of the resort. I was high up on the mountain, and I was completely alone. I called out, more to myself than anyone, "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" There was no response. I felt a sudden rush of dread, an overwhelming sense of fear that something wasn't right. Why wasn't anyone coming to help me? It made no sense. The lifts don't stop for this long unless there's an emergency. The fact that nobody seemed to care about me stuck up here, it didn't sit right with me. I looked again at the operator's booth, still empty. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the operator had left me on purpose. Maybe they had seen something they didn't want to deal with. Maybe they had seen me and decided to leave me up here. Or maybe it was something worse. The snow kept coming down harder, and the wind was making it worse. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore, and my feet were starting to go numb. My stomach twisted into knots, and I knew I needed to get off that lift as quickly as possible. I started looking around, trying to see if I could get off on my own. The lift's cable was too high for me to jump, and there was nothing nearby to help me get down. I kept telling myself to stay calm, that it was probably nothing. But as the minutes ticked by, my mind started to race. I couldn't stay up here much longer. I had to get down. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen and terrified, but eventually, I saw a figure in the distance, walking towards the base of the lift. It wasn't the operator, though. It was a skier. A man. He didn't wave or acknowledge me at all, just walked straight past the lift, his head down, not even looking at me. I called out again, louder this time, "Hey, I'm stuck. Can you help me?" He didn't stop. It was then that I realized something was very wrong. I wasn't just stuck on the lift. I was stuck, alone, in the middle of nowhere, with nobody around to help. And whoever had left me up there was going to make sure I stayed there. When I finally got off the lift, I ran straight to the nearest lodge. I didn't stop for anything. I didn't care about my skis, my gear, nothing. Just ran. And when I finally got inside, shaking and panicked, I tried to explain what happened. But the workers there told me that nobody had been in the lift operator booth all day. There hadn't been a single worker up there since the morning. I don't know who or what was up there with me, but I'll never forget the feeling of being left to freeze in the middle of nowhere. It all started one cold, winter morning, the kind where the snow had been coming down for hours, thick and heavy, coating everything in a soft white blanket. I woke up early that day, just like I always did. The house was quiet, and there was something peaceful about the sound of the wind blowing through the trees outside. I brewed my coffee and stared out the kitchen window, watching the snow fall. It was still dark outside, just after dawn, but I had work to do, and I needed to get moving. I had a small farm on the edge of town, and most days, I was by myself. I didn't mind it. I liked the quiet, the solitude. There was always something that needed attention, whether it was feeding the animals, clearing snow, or making sure everything was in order for the coming winter storms. I'd been living there for a few years, and aside from a few neighbors who lived a few miles away, I didn't interact much with anyone. I liked it that way. When I got to my car, parked in the driveway, I noticed something strange right away. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was just a flyer or something, but as I walked closer, I saw it was a folded note, the edges of it stained with the snow. I hesitated for a second. It wasn't like me to find random notes on my car. But I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a prank or someone trying to get my attention. Maybe one of the neighbors had left it for me, though I couldn't imagine why. Still, I reached for it and unfolded it. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and the words were short, to the point, "Lock the barn door before sundown." I stood there in the snow, staring at the note. I read it over and over, thinking maybe I was missing something. My first thought was that it was some kind of mistake, maybe someone had left it for the wrong person. But then I realized that no one but me would have known I even had a barn. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and none of them ever really came by. I thought about it for a minute, trying to make sense of it. Was it a joke? Maybe someone had been messing with me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't. The note felt urgent, like a warning, and there was something unsettling about it. I shrugged it off, though. It could have just been some weird thing someone thought was funny. I didn't have time to dwell on it. I had work to do. I spent most of the morning clearing snow around the house, making sure the paths were clear and everything was in order. But the note kept nagging at the back of my mind. I kept telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By the time afternoon rolled around, I'd almost forgotten about it. The snow had stopped falling, and the sun had come out, casting a soft glow over everything. I walked outside to check the animals, make sure they were all fed and settled in for the night. The barn was just across the yard from the house, a little ways down the hill. It was a sturdy, old building, nothing fancy, but it did the job. I stored hay in there, kept the animals inside when the weather got bad, and kept tools and equipment. It was never anything too special, just a part of the farm. But the note came back to me, uninvited, as I walked toward the barn. Locked the barn door before sundown. I stopped in my tracks. It was almost sunset, and the shadows were stretching long across the ground. The thought of locking the barn door seemed so odd. I'd never locked it before. It didn't make sense. Why would I? No one ever came by that way, and nothing had ever happened to make me feel like I needed to lock it. But still, there was that nagging feeling. I felt an unease in the pit of my stomach, like someone was watching me, though there was no one in sight. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. I stood there in the snow, staring at the barn. Something in my gut told me I should go inside and lock the door. The idea of not doing it, of just ignoring the note, felt wrong. I don't know why, but I felt like something bad would happen if I didn't. So, I went inside. The air inside the barn was cool and musty, smelling of hay and wood. The door was as I left it, nothing out of the ordinary, but I made sure to lock it anyway, just as the note said. I felt ridiculous, locking a door I'd never locked before, but something about the whole situation was giving me chills. Maybe I was overthinking it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here recently, that something wasn't right. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every noise outside made me jump, and I kept hearing things that didn't make sense, the faint sound of footsteps in the snow, the creak of the floorboards when I was sure no one was around. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or the owls settling, but I knew it was more than that. The whole day had felt off, and the note still weighed on me. The next morning, I got up early and decided to go out and check the barn again. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I had to. I half expected the door to be unlocked, but when I got there, everything was exactly as I'd left it. I couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. But then I noticed something. The footprints in the snow, leading up to the barn. They weren't mine. And they didn't look fresh, not from the snowstorm the night before. They were older, and they led right up to the door. My heart sank. I'd locked the barn door, but someone had been here. Someone had been in my yard, in the snow, just the night before. I don't know who it was or why they left the note. Maybe I'll never know. But after that day, I made sure to always lock that barn door. Even now, years later, I never leave it unlocked, no matter what. Something about that note, about the feeling that came with it, never really left me. I always wondered if I had been just one step away from something much worse. Here's what happened, and I still can't believe I got out of it. I've never written anything like this before, so I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense. I just need to put it somewhere. It was January, and I decided to take a solo trip up to this ski lodge I'd found online. It wasn't one of those big fancy resorts, just a quiet spot tucked into the mountains. I thought it would be a good way to clear my head after the holidays. Work had been stressful, and I wanted time to myself. The place seemed perfect, small, not crowded, just a handful of cabins spread out around the lodge. It felt remote, but not too far from the nearest town. The first day was great. I spent the morning on the slopes and the afternoon sitting by the fireplace in the lodge. It was peaceful, quiet. I even made small talk with the woman who ran the front desk, an older lady named Carol. She seemed nice enough, though she didn't talk much. Just handed me my key and told me to let her know if I needed anything. The trouble started the second day. I was up early, ready to hit the slopes again. It had snowed overnight, and everything looked fresh and untouched. I grabbed my gear from the rack outside my cabin and headed to the lift. When I got there, though, something felt off. My bindings didn't look right. At first, I thought maybe the snow had just settled weird on them overnight, but when I bent down to check, I realized one of the screws was loose. Not just loose, gone. I'm not an expert, but I know enough to realize how dangerous that could have been. If I'd gone down the slope and my binding had come off, I could have broken my leg or worse. I was annoyed, but I figured it was just wear and tear. I took it back to the lodge and borrowed a screwdriver from Carol. I asked her if anyone had messed with the gear rack, but she just shrugged and said no one ever really touched other people's stuff. By the time I got everything fixed, half the morning was gone. I hit the slopes anyway, trying to shake off the weird feeling in my gut. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just bad luck. That evening, when I got back to my cabin, I found a note slipped under the door. It was on plain white paper, folded in half. The handwriting was messy, almost like whoever wrote it was in a hurry. It said, "Don't go back out there." I stood there holding it for what felt like forever, just staring at the words. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of joke. Maybe one of the other guests was messing with me. But the thing was, I hadn't really talked to anyone. Aside from Carol, I hadn't seen much of anyone around. I thought about going to her, showing her the note, but something held me back. It felt silly, like I'd be overreacting. Instead, I locked the door, double-checked all the windows, and tried to convince myself it was nothing. The next day, I almost didn't go skiing. I thought about staying in the cabin, maybe reading or taking a walk around the lodge. But then I got mad. Why should I let some stupid note ruin my trip? I'd spent good money to be there, and I wasn't about to waste it. So, I went back out. At first, everything seemed fine. The slopes were quiet, and the snow was perfect. But after a couple of runs, I started to feel like I was being watched. It's hard to explain, but you know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? It was like that, this constant prickling sensation, like someone's eyes were on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The trees were thick on either side of the trail, and every so often, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks, just out of the corner of my eye. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a deer. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Then, near the bottom of the run, I wiped out. I wasn't going fast, so I wasn't hurt, but when I got up, I noticed something weird. My ski had come loose again. When I looked closer, I realized the same binding I'd fixed the day before was loose again. The screw was still there, but it had been turned almost all the way out. Someone had tampered with it. I was done after that. I took my gear back to the lodge and went straight to Carol. I showed her the ski, told her about the note. She just looked at me, her face blank, and said, "I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you should take it easy for a day or two." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, crunching in the snow. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I grabbed the only thing I could think of, a fire poker I'd seen leaning against the fireplace. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but after a few minutes, the footsteps started again, fading away into the night. In the morning, I found another note. This one was taped to the inside of the window, facing in. It said, "Leave. Now." That was it for me. I packed my stuff and went to the front desk to check out. Carol wasn't there, just a handwritten note saying she'd be back later. I didn't care. I left the key on the counter and drove straight to the nearest town. On the way down the mountain, I noticed something in the rearview mirror, a black truck following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. The road was narrow, and there weren't many ways to get down. But the truck stayed behind me, no matter how fast or slow I went. When I got to town, I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. The truck kept going, but as it passed, I saw the driver. He was wearing a ski mask. I stayed in town that night, at a cheap motel. The next morning, I called the lodge and tried to talk to Carol, but no one answered. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? That someone left me creepy notes and messed with my skis? I still don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is that I'm never going back to that lodge or anywhere near those mountains. We moved into the cabin just before the first big snowfall of the season. It was remote, tucked in the woods about half a mile off a service road. The whole point was to get away for a bit, to slow down, have some peace. It was supposed to be a quiet winter, just me and Aaron. The night it happened, the snow was coming down hard. The wind was loud, shaking the windows and piling snow against the house. Aaron was in the kitchen making tea, and I was trying to get the wood stove going again. The power had gone out a few hours earlier, but we had plenty of firewood, so it wasn't a big deal. The house was dark except for the firelight and a couple of candles. I was adding another log when Erin called me from the front room. Her voice sounded strange, like she wasn't sure she wanted to say what she'd seen. "Do you hear that?" she asked. I stopped and listened. At first, all I could hear was the wind. It was constant, howling through the trees and rattling the door. But then I heard it, something faint, almost drowned out by the storm. A low, steady hum. It sounded like an engine. I went to the window and squinted into the darkness. The snow was blowing so hard I couldn't see more than a few feet. The sound was definitely there, though, somewhere close by. "Maybe someone got stuck," Erin said. She sounded nervous. "Should we check?" I didn't want to go out in the storm, but if someone was stranded, I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed my coat, gloves, and a flashlight. Erin stayed by the window, watching as I opened the door. The cold hit me like a wall, and the wind nearly tore the door out of my hand. I stepped outside, pulling my scarf tighter around my face. The sound of the engine was louder now, coming from somewhere off to the left. I followed it, shining the flashlight through the trees. The snow was already up to my knees, and it was slow going. After a few minutes, I saw something, a dark shape just off the driveway. As I got closer, I realized it was a truck. The front end was buried in snow, almost up to the hood, but the engine was running. The headlights were off, and the windows were fogged up. I walked around to the driver's side and knocked on the glass. No one answered. I tried the door handle, and it opened. The cab was empty. The engine was warm, humming quietly, and the keys were in the ignition. There were footprints in the snow leading away from the truck, disappearing into the trees. Whoever had been inside hadn't been gone long, but there was no sign of them now. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The truck didn't look abandoned. There was a duffel bag on the passenger seat and a thermos in the cup holder. It looked like someone had been sitting there just moments ago. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. I shone the flashlight into the woods, following the footprints, but the snow was coming down so fast they were already fading. I didn't know what to do. The truck was running, but no one was around. It didn't make sense. I hurried back to the house. Erin was waiting by the door, her face pale. "What did you see?" she asked. "There's a truck," I said, "but no one's in it. The engine's on, and there are tracks leading into the woods." She looked past me, toward the driveway, but it was just darkness and snow. "Do you think they're lost?" "I don't know," I said. "It's not safe out there." I didn't see anyone. We stood there for a moment, listening to the storm. The sound of the engine was still faintly audible, blending with the wind. Something about it made my stomach turn. It felt wrong, like whoever had been in the truck had no reason to leave it, especially in this weather. "I'll call someone," Erin said. But the phone was out, and the cell signal was spotty at best. She stared at her phone, shaking it like that would help. "Should we go back out?" I shook my head. "It's too dangerous. We'll wait. If they come back, they'll see the house." We locked the door and sat by the fire, waiting. The minutes dragged on, and the sound of the engine seemed to grow louder, even though the truck hadn't moved. I kept looking at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the yard was empty. Just snow and shadows. After about an hour, I decided to check again. Erin didn't want me to go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. The wind had died down a little, but the snow was deeper now, making it even harder to move. When I reached the truck, the engine was off. The headlights were still dark, and the cab was just as empty as before. The footprints that had led into the woods were completely gone, buried under the fresh snow. It was like no one had ever been there. I walked around the truck, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. The duffel bag was still on the seat, untouched. I opened it, hoping for some clue, but it was just clothes and a few personal items. A wallet, a toothbrush, a pair of gloves. The wallet had an ID, a man named Michael. I didn't recognize the name, and the address wasn't local. I stood there, staring at the truck, trying to make sense of it. The snow muffled everything, making the world feel smaller, like I was the only person left. Then I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees. "Hello?" I called out. The shadow didn't respond. It moved again, closer this time, but I couldn't see who it was. The flashlight beam barely penetrated the darkness. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Michael?" I tried again. The shadow stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the wind. Then, without warning, it darted away, disappearing into the woods. I didn't follow. I ran back to the house as fast as I could, tripping over my own feet in the deep snow. When I burst through the door, Erin jumped. "What happened?" she asked. "There's someone out there," I said, struggling to catch my breath. "I don't know who, but they're not coming to the house." We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire, listening to the storm and watching the windows. The sound of the engine was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been in the woods was still out there, watching. The next morning, when the snow finally stopped, we went outside together. The truck was gone. The only thing left was a patch of flattened snow where it had been. There were no tracks, no sign of how it had been moved. We packed our things and left that afternoon. I don't know what happened to Michael or who was out there that night. I don't want to know. It all started one night, a few weeks after we moved into the house. It was supposed to be a fresh start for the two of us, quiet, peaceful. We had left the city behind for something more private, more spacious. The house was perfect. It sat on the edge of a forest, secluded enough that we could enjoy the solitude but close enough to the town for convenience. It was everything we had wanted. Or at least, it seemed that way. I had noticed the lights at first. At first, it seemed like nothing, just an odd flicker in the distance. It was late, around 11 p.m., and we were sitting in the living room, watching TV. The house was quiet, still, except for the occasional creaks of the old beams settling. The lights blinked again, distant and faint, but still noticeable through the large windows that faced the forest. I didn't think much of it, maybe someone driving by, or the lights from a nearby house. But it kept happening. Every night, like clockwork. The flashes would come, sometimes slow, sometimes rapid. They didn't look like headlights or anything normal. They had a strange rhythm to them, almost deliberate. It was disorienting, and honestly, a little unnerving. "Do you see that?" I asked my husband one night. He glanced up from his phone, squinting toward the dark trees. "Yeah, I do. It's like flashes of light. It's been happening every night," I said. "I wonder if someone's out there." We both agreed that it was probably just some random people camping or using the woods. Maybe it was just the lights from a house further down the road, or maybe there was some kind of outdoor activity going on. But the flashes didn't feel like any of those things. They felt purposeful. After a few more nights of this, I mentioned it to him again. "Maybe we should check it out tomorrow," I suggested. "Get a better look." The next day, we went for a walk toward the edge of the forest, but by the time we reached the area where we thought the lights had been coming from, there was nothing. The trees were quiet, still. No sign of movement, no lights. We stood there for a while, looking at the thick forest that seemed to stretch on forever. "Maybe it was nothing," he said, shrugging. "I don't know. It's weird, though." "Yeah, weird," I agreed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few more nights passed, and the lights returned, just like before. Flashing, blinking, always in the same place. But this time, it wasn't just a distant flicker. I could see it more clearly, the light shining from between the trees, cutting through the darkness. It wasn't just one flash or two. It was like someone was deliberately signaling or sending a message. It felt deliberate. The next night, after dinner, we decided to drive out to the area and take a closer look. It was dark by the time we got in the car, and the forest was thick, wrapping the road in shadows. We turned off the headlights as we approached the edge of the woods, parking the car and getting out quietly. It was eerie, the silence of the trees pressing in around us. We had no idea what we were walking into, but something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't good. As we walked along the edge of the forest, we noticed a faint glow up ahead. I motioned for him to be quiet, and we moved toward it, staying low. We crept through the underbrush, the lights getting brighter as we approached. And then, we saw it. There, between the trees, was a cluster of figures, standing still in the shadows. They were barely visible, but their presence was unmistakable. At first, we thought it was a group of people camping. But as we got closer, I saw what they were doing. They were focused on something, an object, or a device, in the center of their group. A small, portable light was set up, aimed at a screen. I could make out some kind of equipment, cameras, a tripod. It looked like they were setting up something, not just hanging out in the woods. They were watching the house. I could feel my heart pounding. My husband grabbed my arm, pulling me back slowly, but I could still see them clearly now. I saw their faces, their expressions, intent, focused, like they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't just out there for fun. They were doing something deliberate. We quietly backed away, careful not to make any noise. My head was spinning. What was this? Who were they? We went back to the car and drove home in silence, the images of those people still fresh in my mind. But that wasn't the end of it. Over the next few days, the strange behavior continued. We noticed odd things, unfamiliar cars parked on the road outside our house, too close for comfort. There were figures we didn't recognize walking near the edge of the trees, always just out of sight but close enough to make us uncomfortable. And the flashing lights continued, sometimes from different parts of the woods, sometimes in the same spots. I tried to keep calm, but it was getting harder and harder to ignore. It wasn't just some random campers anymore. These people were watching us. And I had no idea why. Finally, we called the police. We weren't sure what they could do, but we couldn't ignore it any longer. When the officers arrived and we explained what was going on, they seemed skeptical. But they agreed to take a look at the area, even if it was just for our peace of mind. A couple of hours later, they came back. We didn't find anyone in the woods, one of the officers told us. But we did find some strange things. There are cameras set up on the trees, and we found traces of equipment they were using to monitor your house. It's a little more than just some random folks messing around. Someone's been spying on us? My voice was trembling. It looks like it. We'll check things out further, but for now, just be careful. We've reported it, and we'll be keeping an eye on the area. We didn't sleep that night. We stayed up, keeping the lights on, watching the windows. In the days that followed, the police increased patrols around our area, but it never felt like enough. I couldn't stop thinking about the people in the woods, the cameras they had set up, and the fact that they had been watching us for God knows how long. Who were they? And what did they want from us? Eventually, the flashes stopped. The strange figures in the woods stopped appearing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been lurking just out of sight, observing us, waiting for something. I don't know if we'll ever find out who those people were or why they were watching us. All I know is that I feel like I'm being watched every time I step outside. Every time I glance toward the trees, I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting. The house was what I'd been looking for, a quiet place outside the city where I could clear my head. It was a fixer-upper, but I wasn't in a rush to make it perfect. It had an overgrown backyard with a lot of trees, a small creek running along the edge of the property, and a shed about 30 yards from the back door. The shed caught my attention the first time I saw it. It was old, with weathered wood and a rusted padlock on the door. The realtor didn't say much about it, just that it had been locked for years and no one knew what was inside. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured I'd deal with it eventually, but there were more pressing things, like fixing the leaky roof and cleaning out the junk the previous owner had left behind. The first few weeks in the house were peaceful. I worked during the day, came home to a quiet evening, and slowly started making the place my own. The shed stayed locked, untouched, but I found myself looking at it more and more when I was outside. There was something about it that bothered me. One weekend, I finally decided to check it out. The lock was rusted, but it held tight. I tried prying the door open with a crowbar, but it wouldn't budge. Frustrated, I gave up and told myself I'd get a bolt cutter later. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the shed. I wasn't sure why it bothered me so much. It wasn't unusual for old properties to have locked sheds or storage areas. Still, I felt uneasy, like there was something about it I wasn't supposed to see. A week went by, and I still hadn't bought the bolt cutter. I told myself I was just procrastinating, but deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to open it. Then, one night, I came home late and noticed something strange. The padlock was gone. The door was slightly open, just enough to see the darkness inside. I froze in the yard, staring at it. I was certain the lock had been there the day before. The shed hadn't been touched in years. Even the weeds around it looked undisturbed. I didn't go near it that night. I locked all the doors and windows in the house and stayed up, listening for any sounds outside. The wind rustled the trees, and the creek gurgled in the distance, but nothing unusual happened. The next morning, I walked out to the shed. The door was still open, creaking slightly in the breeze. I hesitated before stepping inside. The air was musty, filled with the smell of damp wood and mildew. At first, it didn't seem like there was much inside. Old tools hung on the walls, covered in cobwebs. The floor was cluttered with broken pots, rusted metal, and other junk. But as I moved deeper into the shed, I noticed something that didn't belong. In the corner, there was a pile of camping gear, an old sleeping bag, a flashlight, a few cans of food, and a water bottle. Everything looked used but not abandoned. The sleeping bag was rolled neatly, and the food cans weren't expired. I felt my chest tighten as I realized what it meant. Someone had been living here. I backed out of the shed, my eyes scanning the yard and the tree line. It was quiet, but I didn't feel alone. I went back inside the house and locked the door. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the camping gear, about the open door, about how the lock had disappeared. I tried to tell myself it was just some drifter who had moved on, but I didn't believe it. The next morning, I called a locksmith and had new locks installed on all the doors. I also bought a security camera and set it up facing the shed. I wanted to know if anyone came back. For a few days, nothing happened. The camera didn't pick up anything, and I started to think maybe I'd been overreacting. But then, one night, I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint, like footsteps crunching on gravel. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed. The shed door was open again. My stomach dropped. I watched the screen, my hand shaking, but I didn't see anyone. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to go to the window. I peered out, trying to stay hidden behind the curtain. There was someone standing by the shed. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket. He had his back to the house and seemed to be looking at something inside the shed. I couldn't see his face. I stayed frozen at the window, too scared to move. After what felt like an eternity, the man stepped back from the shed and walked toward the trees. He disappeared into the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window, waiting to see if he would come back, but he didn't. The next morning, I checked the shed. The camping gear was gone. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, leading from the shed to the trees. I called the police and told them everything. An officer came out and looked around, but there wasn't much they could do. They said it was probably a homeless person using the shed for shelter. I wanted to believe them, but something about the man didn't seem right. He hadn't just been hiding out. He had been watching. I didn't stay in the house much longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the man might come back. I sold the property a few months later and moved into an apartment in the city. I still think about that night sometimes, about the man by the shed and the way he disappeared into the trees. I'll never know who he was or what he wanted, and maybe that's for the best. The The storm hit harder than I expected. The wind screamed through the rigging, and rain lashed against the windows of the cabin. The rocking of the boat made it impossible to sleep, and I was already regretting not waiting for better weather before anchoring out here. It was supposed to be a quiet night on the water. Just me, my little boat, and some space to breathe. I decided to go up and check the lines. The anchor had held steady so far, but the wind had picked up, and the waves were getting rougher. I threw on my rain jacket and climbed out onto the deck, the cold rain soaking through my pants in seconds. The sea was black, except for the white caps on the waves, and visibility was terrible. My flashlight beam barely cut through the sheets of rain. I was securing the stern line when I saw a dark shape bobbing on the waves, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. At first, I thought it was debris, maybe a piece of driftwood or a lost buoy, but then a wave lifted it, and I realized it was another boat. It was small, about the same size as mine, and it didn't look like it was anchored. It was just drifting, tilting wildly with the waves. Then I heard a voice, faint but distinct, cutting through the wind and rain. "Hey! Over here! Help!" I froze, gripping the railing. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me!" I swung my flashlight toward the boat, squinting through the rain. There was a man on board, waving his arms. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his head, and he was shouting something I couldn't make out. My first instinct was to grab my radio, but I didn't want to leave him out there. The current was strong, and if his boat wasn't anchored, it could drift into the rocks. I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted back, "Are you okay?" "Come closer," he yelled, his voice cracking. "I need help." I hesitated. The storm was bad, and maneuvering my boat closer to his in these conditions would be risky. Still, I couldn't just ignore him. I grabbed the radio from inside the cabin and called for the Coast Guard, giving them my position and explaining the situation. They said they'd send someone, but with the weather, it could take time. I returned to the deck, flashlight in hand. His boat had drifted closer, and I could see him more clearly now. He looked frantic, pacing the deck and waving his arms. "Hurry up," he shouted. "You need to help me." "What's wrong?" I called back. He stopped pacing and stared at me. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stood there, letting the rain hammer down on him. Then he pointed at me, his arm trembling. "You stole from me." The accusation caught me off guard. "What are you talking about?" I shouted. "You took my supplies," he yelled, his voice raw. "I know it was you. You think I didn't see you?" I shook my head, confused. "I don't even know you. I've been here all night." "You're lying," he screamed, his voice breaking into a guttural roar. He climbed onto the bow of his boat, wobbling as a wave rocked it violently. "You think you can just take what's mine and get away with it?" I felt my stomach twist. He wasn't acting like someone who needed help. His movements were erratic, his voice filled with rage. "Look, I don't have your supplies," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just stay on your boat. The Coast Guard is on their way." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that didn't match the situation. "You called them?" he sneered. "What are they gonna do, huh? They won't get here in time." "In time for what?" I asked, my throat dry. He didn't answer. Instead, he climbed down into the cabin of his boat, disappearing from view. My heart was pounding now. I didn't know what he was doing, but every instinct was screaming at me to get back inside my own cabin. I stumbled down the steps, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the radio and called the Coast Guard again. "He's acting strange," I told them. "I think he's dangerous." The operator's voice was calm, but I could tell they were taking it seriously. They told me to stay inside and keep my distance. I turned off all the lights in the cabin, crouching by the window. His boat was closer now, barely 10 yards away. I could see his shadow moving inside, hear the thud of something heavy being dragged across the deck. Then he emerged, holding what looked like a long pole or a crowbar. My blood went cold. "Get out here," he bellowed, his voice echoing across the water. "You think you can hide from me?" I stayed as still as possible, hoping he couldn't see me through the rain-streaked window. He climbed onto the edge of his boat, leaning dangerously far over. For a moment, I thought he might fall into the water, but he caught his balance and pointed the crowbar at my boat. "You don't deserve any of it," he shouted. "You're just like the rest of them." I didn't know what he was talking about, but I didn't want to find out. I grabbed a flare gun from the emergency kit and loaded it, my hands trembling. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The man started pulling on a rope, dragging something heavy across the deck of his boat. It took me a moment to realize what he was doing. He was tying the boats together. If he got close enough, he could climb onto my deck. Panic set in. I aimed the flare gun out the window, shouting, "Stay back. I'm warning you." He froze, staring at the flare gun. For a moment, I thought he might back off. Then he smiled a slow, crooked grin that made my skin crawl. "You don't have it in you," he said. I fired the flare. It shot through the air, lighting up the stormy sky in a burst of red. The man ducked, losing his balance and tumbling backward onto his deck. His boat rocked violently, and the rope he'd been tying slipped out of his hands, splashing into the water. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I started my engine and pulled up the anchor as quickly as I could. The waves were rough, the wind nearly pushing me off course, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. As I sped away, I glanced back over my shoulder. His boat was drifting again, the light from his cabin flickering in the rain. He was standing on the deck, watching me go. Even from a distance, I could feel his eyes on me, burning with anger. The Coast Guard found me an hour later, safely anchored near the harbor. They searched the area where I'd been, but they didn't find his boat. They said it might have drifted further out to sea or been swamped by the waves. Part of me hoped they were right, but another part of me wasn't so sure. I never thought I'd be writing something like this, but I've been sitting on it for a few days now and can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. I've been out hiking alone for years, and never once did I feel unsafe. But that day, everything felt wrong from the moment I started back to my car. It was late afternoon when I began my hike, nothing too long, just a trail I knew well. I love being in nature, the kind of quiet where you can hear the wind in the trees and nothing else. It was peaceful, and I felt like I could walk forever. The trail is not difficult. It's mostly just a loop through the woods, with some nice views along the way. But by the time I got to the point where I decided to turn around, the sun was beginning to dip lower, and I knew it would be getting dark soon. The hike back was going fine. I could hear the birds and the rustling of the trees, but that's normal for the woods, especially when it's getting close to dusk. But then I started to hear footsteps behind me. I didn't think much of it at first. People walk on the trail, and sometimes they get a little too close. I figured it was someone else coming back from the other side. It didn't bother me. I kept walking, my pace steady, but the footsteps kept up with me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him. There was a man about 20 yards behind me. Not too far, but far enough that I couldn't make out much detail. At first, I thought it was just some other hiker, but then something hit me. He was walking at the same pace as me. I hadn't heard any rustling through the brush or anything that would make sense for him to be there so quietly. I felt my stomach tighten. I didn't want to start overthinking it, but my instincts kicked in. I sped up a little, trying to walk faster without making it obvious. The man did the same. He wasn't running or anything, but it felt like he was purposely matching my steps. I kept trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but the more I walked, the more unnerving it became. Every time I turned a corner or glanced behind me, he was there, keeping the same distance. At that point, I started getting a little more nervous. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail when I started, and this guy hadn't passed me coming the other way. And now, here he was, walking right behind me, moving at the same pace. I quickened my steps a little more, trying not to break into a full run. Maybe I was being paranoid, maybe it was nothing, but something wasn't right. Then it happened. As I pushed myself a little faster, trying to create some space between us, I reached the part of the trail where it narrows, just a small section with some thick bushes and rocks on either side. It's not much of a bottleneck, but it's one of those spots where you feel more enclosed. As I rounded a bend, I looked up ahead, and that's when I saw him. A second man. He was standing in the middle of the path, blocking the way. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I could see his face now, pale, unshaven, and expressionless. He wasn't even moving. He just stood there, staring at me. I thought about turning back, but the man behind me was closer now. Much closer. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear his footsteps, steady and deliberate, closing the distance. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could feel the panic rising in my throat. "Excuse me, can I pass?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though it came out more like a question than a statement. The man didn't answer. He just kept staring at me, not blinking, like he was waiting for something. My breath started coming faster. I had no idea what this was about, but my gut told me I needed to get out of there. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable, but it was the sound of the footsteps behind me that really made my heart race. I glanced over my shoulder quickly. The man behind me was now very close, just a few feet away. I could hear him breathing, but it wasn't out of exertion. It was slow, almost methodical. My mind was racing, my options narrowing. There was no way I was turning around to face him. I took a step back, instinctively moving closer to the side of the trail, trying to create some space, but the man in front of me didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my palms were sweating. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just stand there. I had to make a move, but I didn't know which direction was safe anymore. "Hey," the man finally spoke. His voice was low, but not threatening, or at least it didn't sound that way. "Where are you going?" I didn't answer. My mind was spinning too fast. Why wasn't he letting me pass? Why hadn't I heard his footsteps approaching earlier? Was he waiting for the other guy to catch up? Every fiber of my being was screaming to get away from both of them. The man stepped toward me, blocking the trail completely now. I could hear the other man behind me, too, now even closer, almost right on my heels. My pulse was so loud in my ears, I was sure they could hear it. Without thinking, I made my move. I ducked to the side, squeezing past the man in front of me and running up the trail. I could hear the sound of shoes hitting the dirt, the quickened pace of the two men following me. I didn't look back. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran, but my legs felt like they were on fire. I didn't care. I couldn't stop. All I could think about was putting as much distance between myself and them as possible. The trail ahead started to open up again, and I knew if I could make it to the wider part of the path, I'd have more room to maneuver, more space to escape. Finally, I burst out of the woods, back onto the main trail, the clearing just up ahead. The men didn't follow me into the open. They stopped at the tree line, and I could hear them calling out to me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back until I was at my car, breathing hard, hands shaking. I never saw them again. But when I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone during that hike. I'm not sure what they wanted, but I know I wasn't just imagining things. There were two of them, and they followed me. I don't know if they were waiting for me to make a mistake or if they had something planned, but I got out of there before it could happen. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I don't think I'll ever feel safe doing that again. I was out fishing by the lake late one night. I liked the quiet, especially on weekdays when no one else really came out that way. The lake was a bit out of the way, and it was mostly locals who knew about it, but most of them didn't come around after dark. I didn't mind, though. I had my flashlight, my tackle box, and I was fine with just a couple hours out there by myself, casting out into the calm water. It was peaceful. The moon was almost full, so I could see pretty well even without the flashlight. It was quiet, just the sound of the water lapping up against the shore, crickets buzzing off in the trees. I cast out a line, settled into my folding chair, and let myself just relax for a bit. I wasn't expecting much to bite that night, but that didn't really matter to me. After a little while, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, down the shore. Just a dark shape at first, not really close, but close enough that I could tell someone else was out there. Another fisherman, it looked like. He didn't have a light on him, which was a bit strange, especially at night, but I figured maybe he was just real comfortable out here in the dark. I didn't pay him too much mind at first, just focused on my own line. Every so often, I'd look over and see him standing there, just a dark outline against the trees. I couldn't see much of him, just that he was tall and sort of hunched over, maybe leaning down to check his line or his tackle. He didn't seem to move much. I thought maybe he was just waiting for a bite, the same as I was. About half an hour went by like that. I'd look up every now and then, and he'd still be there, standing near the edge of the water. He seemed to have moved a little closer, but it was hard to tell for sure in the dark. I shrugged it off, figured he was just walking along the shore to get to a better spot. But then, the next time I looked, he was definitely closer. Maybe only about 30 or 40 feet away now, standing still, facing my direction. It felt strange. Normally, people would call out, make a little conversation, but he was just watching. Or at least, it felt like he was. I couldn't make out his face, couldn't even see if he had any gear on him, but he was standing there like he was waiting for something. I thought about calling out to him, just to break the silence, but something about it made me hesitate. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I felt this knot in my stomach, like something wasn't right. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that he was just another guy out fishing, but that feeling wouldn't go away. Then, after a few minutes, he moved again. Just a few steps closer. It was almost like he thought I wouldn't notice if he inched forward slowly enough. Now he was only about 20 feet away, standing right at the water's edge. I could just barely make out his features. He was tall, with a sort of thin, bony build, his clothes looking a bit too loose on him, like they didn't quite fit. His face was shadowed, but I could see his eyes glinting a bit in the moonlight, just watching me. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I tried to focus on my line, tried to ignore him, but it was impossible. I could feel his gaze on me, just waiting. Then, he took another step forward, his shoes making a quiet crunch on the rocks by the shore. I glanced up, hoping he'd maybe say something, explain what he was doing, but he was silent. Just staring. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I cleared my throat, my voice coming out a bit shaky, more than I wanted it to. You here for the night too? He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at me. Then, after a long pause, he said, "How long are you planning to stay out here?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, like he didn't want to disturb the quiet around us. But there was something off about it. It felt flat, empty, like he was just saying the words without any real feeling behind them. The way he said it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Not too long," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just until I get a bite or two." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving me. "It's a good night for fishing," he said, his voice still that strange, empty tone. "Not too many people out." "Yeah," I replied, feeling more uncomfortable by the second. "That's why I like it out here." He didn't respond. He just kept watching me, his head tilted slightly, like he was studying me. Then, without warning, he took another step forward, then another, until he was only about 10 feet away. I gripped my fishing rod tighter, my mind racing. I didn't know what he wanted, but the way he was moving, the way he was just staring, it didn't feel right. I forced myself to stand up, trying to look more confident than I felt. "I think I'm gonna pack up," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet. "Got an early morning tomorrow." He didn't move. Just kept staring at me with those glinting eyes, his face still mostly hidden in shadow. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, almost like he was disappointed. "Yeah," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to me. "Didn't catch anything anyway." I started gathering my things, moving as quickly as I could without making it obvious I was rushing. But as I was bending down to grab my tackle box, I heard him take another step forward. I glanced up, and he was even closer now, only about 5 feet away. I could see his face more clearly in the moonlight, his eyes wide, too wide, with a strange intensity that made my stomach twist. "You should stay," he said, his voice softer now, almost like a suggestion. "It's a good night." I swallowed hard, my hand shaking as I shoved my gear into my bag. "Maybe some other time," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He just watched me, a slight smile creeping onto his face, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to make a mistake. I could feel his eyes on me as I finished packing up, his gaze never leaving me. I slung my bag over my shoulder, trying to act casual as I turned to head back toward the path that led to my car. But as I started walking, I heard his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, matching my pace. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to see that look in his eyes again, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was right there, following me, that same strange smile on his face. I quickened my pace, hoping he'd take the hint and stay behind, but he just matched my speed, staying close enough that I could hear his breathing, shallow and steady, right behind me. Finally, I reached the path and broke into a fast walk, almost a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, never slowing, never speeding up, just keeping that same, steady pace. When I reached the parking lot, I practically ran to my car, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely unlock the door. I got in, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my breath coming in short gasps. I looked up, and he was standing just a few feet away, staring at me through the windshield, that same unsettling smile on his face. He didn't move, didn't say a word. He just watched me, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was memorizing my face. I started the engine, my hands still shaking, and pulled out of the lot as fast as I could. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, and he was still standing there, watching me, that same strange smile on his face, his figure fading into the darkness as I sped down the road. I didn't look back again. I didn't want to see if he was still there. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the lake and that strange man were nothing but a memory in my rearview mirror.